Rules Committee will come to order, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Before we get started too far, I want to acknowledge that the gentlewoman has her favorite Kentucky Wildcats in the game tonight, and I see that she is ready, got the flying the flag. Congratulations. And everybody's good. Today, the Rules Committee is going to have two very special guests, among others, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Chairman Paul Ryan, and the gentleman from Maryland, the ranking member of the, the ranking member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Van Hollen, as we consider H. Con Res 96, the federal budget for fiscal year 2015. This important duty of the United States Congress is to effectively and efficiently use its power of the purse to help grow our economy, create new opportunities for all Americans, to ensure that our nation's brightest days lie in our future, but perhaps more importantly, to make sure that we have a clean opportunity to speak to this federal government to help them with the priorities that we see best for the American people. It's our opportunity to make sure that the clarity and the direction that we believe the federal government should go is why we are doing this budget. And I believe this legislation before us today does exactly that. Unfortunately, our fiscal house is not in order, and we have over $17 trillion of a nation's debt right now is out of control, and there's no end in sight. By 2030, if we continue down this current reckless path, entitlements and interest payments on the debt will consume all federal revenue. All other spending will be done with borrowed dollars. So we're here today to avoid such a dire scenario. I believe that the gentleman from Wisconsin brings a House Republican budget, which is aptly named the Path to Prosperity, which provides a sensible, growth-minded blueprint that reduces wasteful spending by $5.1 trillion and balances the budget in 10 years. A balanced budget is the only way to reverse the course of our country, which is out of control spending. Additionally, this budget proposal ensures that our nation's military has the resources to protect our interests at home and abroad, strengthening the safety net, helping needy Americans, secure Social Security and Medicare, and it makes sure that we do the right things to sustain the pathway to making the lives better for our children and our grandchildren. Today we have an opportunity, as I'd stated, to have two of the brightest minds in Congress that are before us. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Chairman Ryan, has worked very diligently on that, and he is joined by his very, very able cohort also from the Budget Committee, the ranking member, the gentleman from Maryland, my dear friend. And I am delighted that you're both here. I would now, before I defer to both these young gentlemen, I will defer to the gentlewoman from New York, the ranking member of the committee, Mrs. Slaughter. Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad all my folks are here on our side to welcome both of you here this afternoon. But I leaning heavily toward Mr. Van Hollen's budget. Because far from the path to prosperity, I think the GOP budget's a recipe for ruin. For the fourth year in a row, the majority's proposed a budget that would destroy millions of jobs, continuing to tilt the economic playing field in favor of the wealthy and the well-connected at the expense of everyone else. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that the Ryan budget would ultimately reduce GDP by 2.5% and would destroy 3 million jobs by 2016, while simultaneously cutting funds for job training. The budget proposal slashes funding for K through 12 education, eliminates 29,000 educators' jobs, eliminates college scholarships, and saddles students with even more college loan debt. It is a true sleight of hand budget. It repeals all of the benefits of the Affordable Care Act, but keeps all of the law's savings, which is really a trick. It reduces funding for FEMA, for travel safety, for Amtrak, for clean energy initiatives, and medical research. It zeroes out funding for arts, humanities, and public broadcasting so that not even Big Bird or Elmo are spared in Mr. Ryan's budget. If there's a program you care about or your family relies on, the chances are the House Republicans are trying to cut it, all to pay for another round of tax breaks for millionaires and corporations. So I look forward to the testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentleman for her comments and welcome both of you today. You know, a common theme from some members of Congress is that you got to spend more money rather than get something that makes it better, and I've heard this over and over and over, so that probably shows the difference between the two sides. I'm for sustainability, and I'm delighted that we have the Rules Committee here, both of you today, without objection. Anything you have in writing will be entered into the record, and we appreciate both of you taking time to be here today. The gentleman, the chairman of the committee, Mr. Ryan, is recognized.
Thank you. I'll ask just that my full statement be included in the record. Ms. Van Houwen and I were just discussing, since we have other members that need to come and testify, we'll waive our opening statements. I'll proceed right to questions. This is the fourth budget in a row we have brought before this committee, before Congress, achieving the same goals we set out to achieve to balance the budget and pay off the debt. Big differences of opinion between our approaches and our budgets, and I'll just leave it at that for my opening statement and just look forward to questions.
Thank the gentleman very much. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized. Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you and the ranking member and all the members of the committee. Look forward to your questions. Just in summary, obviously we make very different choices in our budgets that we think better reflect the priorities and values of the country and the American public. We look forward to debating those issues on the floor of the House in the days to come, as well as some of the other alternatives, and I'm sure some of those issues will come out during the questioning here, possibly. But again, why don't I leave it at that for now, and we welcome any questions that you've got to go into more detail on the budget.
Great. Thank you very much. At least a full year ago, there was a big debate and a discussion about both bodies undertaking the need to produce a budget. And I would say to you that I believe that this has helped greatly clarify in many people's minds the responsibilities, what I consider to be a really basic responsibility. Mr. Ryan, you just a few months ago had an agreement. Is this budget trying to codify and put that into place, and now you're trying to live up to what you believe is the correct way to do business, and that is the hard work of putting together a budget, making sure you come before this committee, making sure we have a vote on it, and making sure we do the right thing, a responsible activity on behalf of the United States House of Representatives?
That's right. We think it's important for Congress to be obviously in the habit of budgeting every year. The agreement that we reached in December with the Senate is a 2-year agreement that's in place now and for this upcoming fiscal year. We thought that was good progress made. We thought it was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't the full vision of what we think we need to do to get our fiscal house in order. That's what this represents. So technically speaking, one does not have to do a budget right now because appropriations are on schedule to be formed. But if you think the fiscal house is in order, that's a fine position. We don't think it's in order. We think we need to balance our budget. We think we need to get a government to live within its means and to pay off our debt so the children and grandchildren of this country get a debt-free nation. We know that if you live above your means today, you will live below your means tomorrow, and that's what we're doing to this country. And so that's why we have a comprehensive budget, very similar to the last 3 budgets we brought, to do just that. To his credit, the minority has also brought forward budgets. So I would say that here in the House, we have a pretty good track record of proposing budgets for this country. Very different budgets with different goals and aspirations, but it's important that we stay in this mode of actually budgeting, making decisions, prioritizing, and showing people what it is we're trying to achieve. Now, I take issue with their descriptions of our budget, and we'll probably get into that. I know we will for the next 3 days on the floor, but it's important that we do this, and that's why this exercise matters.
Both of you, I believe, have had substantial time to understand each other's bills, meaning, Mr. Ryan, that you understand exactly where Mr. Van Hollen is coming from with his budget. Mr. Van Hollen, I suspect you have had an ample opportunity to understand Mr. Ryan's budget. Mr. Ryan, you proposed a budget, as you have done in the past, that balances the budget. And And I presume that is because you're for a balanced budget.
Right. Correct.
But there are some things that loom ahead for a budget person that you could probably see that really are reasons why you'd be for a balanced budget. One of those might be interest on the national debt. Could you please talk about your perspective, what we need to know as members of the Rules Committee about what looms ahead in that endeavor, sir?
We are starting to run out of time. And what I mean when I say that is we have low interest rates right now. We know that the Federal Reserve will begin, quote unquote, normalizing their policy, which means interest rates will begin to go up. It's not clear exactly where they will result. Based on current projections by the Congressional Budget Office, our interest on our debt is slated to quadruple over the next decade from $223 billion a year to $880 billion a year. That's just on interest on the debt. If interest rates increase beyond what are being projected, we have a serious problem on our hands, and we basically lose control of our fiscal situation. Point number one. Point number two, we have an aging issue in this country. We have baby boomers that are retiring, 10,000 a day at that pace for 10 years. And the very important programs that they rely upon when they retire grow faster than our economy grows, than tax revenues grow, than inflation, anywhere from 6 to 8% a year. And so when you have an effective doubling of the retirement population and dramatic increases in the programs that they need, that they use, that they count upon, you have a huge budget train wreck coming down the road. And so what we're saying is time is of the essence. And if we act soon to fix this problem, we can put important reforms in these very critical programs, particularly our health care entitlement programs, that guarantee that people in or near retirement don't see changes in these programs because they, after all, paid for these programs, they're counting on them. But we know that those of us who are after the baby boom generation, I'm in the X generation, everybody after that, we know that these programs are going bankrupt. We know that the government is making promises to us that it cannot keep. And so what we're trying to do is get ahead of that problem, reform these programs so that we really truly do have bankable, actionable, reliable health and retirement security now and into the future. And by getting ahead of this budget problem today, we guarantee people in retirement they're going to have what they have coming to them. We guarantee that we don't have a huge increase on the interest on our debt. We keep our deficits low. We get it balanced and paid off. And what the Congressional Budget Office tells us is if you do this, like they've measured with us, you'll get faster economic growth. By the end of the budget window, CBO is telling us we'll have 1.8% higher economic growth than we otherwise would have if we didn't get ahead of our fiscal problems. That translates into $1,100 per person in more take-home pay because of a better economy because we got ahead of our fiscal problems. That's why we're doing this.
Mr. Ryan, you said $223 billion to $880 billion.
I'm just doing it off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure that's the baseline.
Good gosh. Will that be in first place of spending? Will that be the largest portion of government spending?
It gets there, yes. It's not now, but it does get there, especially if we have a shock in interest rates that we don't predict. This is what happened to Europe, and we don't want it to happen to us. And in Europe, once that crisis hits, then you're playing catch-up, you're in crisis mode, and you're cutting in real time. Real seniors, real safety net, all of those things. Oh, and by the way, you're slowing down your economy at the same time. We want to prevent that bitter austerity from coming here. This is an austerity preemption budget because it also provides pro-growth solutions to get job growth, economic growth, and to get this debt under control.
Mr. Rand, you get pushed by members of Congress who, I believe, at least by this member, and I know others, and you accept the challenge yourself of trying to look ahead over not just the horizon, but really to your children's future. And you did not reference it directly, but I'd like for you to talk about unfunded liabilities.
So unfunded liabilities are a calculation of the promises government is making right now to Americans alive today that it does not have the means of paying for. There are a lot of different estimates of this. The General Accountability Office does an estimate. The Federal Reserve does estimates. There are prominent economists like Larry Kotlikoff who does estimates. And you want some water here? What it does is they say, okay, what is the 3-generational window commitment What is the the commitment for my mom, who's on Social Security and Medicare? What is the generation for my age, the working generation, and then for my kids? And what is the commitment that America is making to those three generations, retirees, workers, and their children? And how shy are we of being able to keep that commitment? And that estimate ranges between $100 to $200 trillion. These estimates go all over the place, but the more conservative general accountability estimate runs about $100 trillion of promises the government is making to those three generations of Americans today that it has no way of keeping.
I think I've got one more question. I don't mean to use the word sleight of hand, but how we describe things that are off into the future and act like perhaps they're not there is the sleight of hand I'm in reference to. Isn't it true that if we had GDP growth, that we could feel better about all this and look honestly not only at ourselves in the mirror, but to the American people when we go back home about where we're headed and what we're doing?
That's why we're proposing pro-growth energy policy, pro-growth tax reform, and that's why we're also demonstrating that long-term deficit reduction is also pro-growth. To give you an illustration of that, at this time last year versus now, the Congressional Budget Office had a projection and a view into the economy going forward over the next 10 years, and their view of the economy 10 years forward from last year to this year is that they downgraded their projection of the economy from 2.9% average growth down to 2.5% average growth. Now, off the top of your head, if you don't really get into these numbers, you think, well, that's not a huge deal. That 0.4 of a reduction of economic growth is $1.4 trillion in lost revenues. Our deficit is about $1.2 trillion higher as a result of that slower economic growth, not to mention the fewer jobs that are being available, the lower take-home pay that comes with that. And so when you have slower growth, it does great damage to the fiscal bottom line of this country, which makes it harder to balance the budget and longer to pay off the debt if you ever get there.
I said it'd be my last question, but I think it's germane. I didn't know what your answer would be, but Mr. Ryan, I recall that there are lots of models out there, whether it be Greece, whether it be Iceland, whether it be now France, who are looking at, I think, essentially the pathway that our president and our friends, the Democrats, are barreling down and very happy with. Talk me out of that, or tell me what the truth is about the problem with overspending and under-delivery of jobs. Are we headed down that pathway, or are we not?
Well, yeah, CBO is downgrading their growth forecast for this country going forward. And I believe that that's a result of the economic policies we've been practicing for a few years now. We have the lowest labor force participation rate in 35 years. We have new government programs like the Affordable Care Act, which are slowing down labor force participation, making it less likely that people will be supplying labor or working in this country, and that slows down the economy. So we have lots of evidence of that, and that slower economic growth means less revenues, fewer jobs, and a bigger fiscal problem. So that's why we do believe that you need a combination of pro-growth policies, sensible entitlement reforms, and you need to cut spending money that we don't have by cutting wasteful Washington spending. Government does waste a lot of money. We all know that. So we need to have, we believe, serious budget caps to force the kind of discipline you need in Congress to really scrub and scrutinize these budgets. One of the reasons why I was in favor of the budget agreement I reached with the Senate is finally Congress is back in the business of actually appropriating, actually scrubbing the budgets of government agencies to go after that waste. We haven't done that for a long time. We have an opportunity now this year to do that, but we've got to go far more than that, because these really important entitlements, Medicare in particular, which is one of the biggest unfunded liability, that's a very important program, its trust fund goes bankrupt in 2026. We have problems in the future of this program that future seniors will not be able to rely on it if we don't fix it. And the sooner we fix it, the better off everybody's going to be. And the sooner we fix it, the more likely we can make sure that those in and near retirement see no disruption in their services.
Thank you very much. Ms. Van Hollen, I know you and I, as dear friends, you wanted me to put you on the end of my questions, but I'm going to defer that until we have other people on the committee, and I appreciate you being here. And as always, Chris, thank you very much for helping out your colleague there with a glass of water. He needs that. The gentlewoman, Mrs. Fox, Vice Chairman of the committee, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you both for being here today. I think the chairman has done a superb job of asking questions and getting some things out on the table. I want to tell you, Mr. Ryan, that I do my best to be as eloquent as you are when you're describing these things, but it seems to me that these numbers flow through your veins somehow or another. And
Been doing it a long time.
You're able to put them out there very well. But there's something I often quote you on, and I'd really appreciate it. You've gone all around it in your comments that you gave to the chairman, and you've been saying it for a long time. We have a moral responsibility here, and I think it is not something that's talked about enough. Again, you've alluded to that we're trying to avert a crisis. Your concern about seniors and what will happen to them if we don't deal with it. You talk about the debt we're leaving to our children. And I wonder, because I do think that it's important that we highlight our responsibility outside what I consider any political aspect. Because there are, as Mr. Van Hollen has said, and you've said, very different approaches to this. And I frankly can't understand why people don't accept the moral responsibility that is being presented here to us in terms of the future. But as I said, you do it much more eloquently than I do. So I wonder if you'd put it in that context for us, as you so beautifully do sometimes.
Well, I won't use a number. I'll just explain the choices we have in front of us. Our government has made very important commitments to Americans on things that we, I think, agree with, which is health and retirement security, particularly for people who've retired. We need to keep those commitments, and we believe that we can keep those commitments, but to better guarantee that we can keep those commitments as they're now designed for people who are already retired, you know, like my mom, and people who are about to plan retirement, that we need to shore them up by reforming these programs for those of us who are a little longer away from retiring, because we know that these programs cannot exist like they're currently designed for us when we retire. And so we have a moral obligation to reform these programs so government can fulfill this mission. We also have an obligation to have an economy that's growing so that we can continue to create jobs to get people from who are out of work back into the workforce. We want to have a faster growing economy so we can have more take-home pay. People are getting squeezed. People are seeing higher prices in food, in rent, in mortgages, in gasoline and energy, but they're not seeing higher take-home pay. And if we can get the right economic policies in place, we can get faster growth, more wages, and higher take-home pay. And we know what we need to do that. And we've also experimented with different economic ideas, which is the idea that we can just spend our way to prosperity, that we can borrow more money, and tax successful small businesses that create most of our jobs, and that will work. And we've already sort of disproven that theory, I would argue, and the evidence is the last 5 years. The lowest recovery since World War II after a recession. And so we think there's a better way to go, and we think that we owe our children a debt-free future. The administration has never once ever proposed a budget that ever balances, let alone pays down the debt. The president is giving us a budget that has a $17 trillion debt going up to $24 trillion, and then on from there. We want to pay it off so that the next generation doesn't have to pay our bills before they can start working for themselves. That's the moral component to this. And so we know without a shadow of a doubt, CBO tells us this, that we are guaranteeing a lower standard of living for the next generation if we stay on the path we are on. That's our point. And the argument I would make is we can fulfill these important social contracts that we have with each other, like health and retirement security, a safety net, strong national defense, by reforming the way these programs work so that we can keep the promise to current seniors, those of us who are in our prime time of life can have programs that we can rely upon, but we can reform government to make it leaner, to make it more efficient, to make it work better, so that our kids don't inherit our debts so that they can have a better life. That's the legacy of this country. Leave the next generation better off. We know, without a shadow of a doubt, if we don't change course and fix this soon, we will be consigning them to a lower standard of living, something we've never done in this country before.
Thank you very much. Very well stated, and I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. I have no further comments or questions.
I thank the gentlewoman from New York. The ranking member is now recognized.
Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chairman, I understand that when we come here, we normally waste time. I mean, almost nothing ever comes out of here goes to the Senate. But nothing, I think, separates us as much from as one party to another in this House as to what we think the future should be and who we think should be encouraged and helped, and what we think is really a recipe for a good America, what we need, and our moral obligation, frankly, because it is a lot of that. So given that, there are so many things I don't understand. First, let me quote Chairman Rogers, Chair of Appropriations Committee last week, on April 2nd said, quote, the Ryan budget, is not going to become binding. It's not a law by any stretch. It's pretty draconian, end quote. So, I mean, I think that says, again, that almost all of us here understand that what we're doing, mostly in the House of Representatives, is full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Now, at the same time that we talk about cutting and spending and all this, this House passed a piece of legislation last week in connection with the Affordable Care Act that added $74 billion to the deficit for no reason that we could come up with, but that's not even a part of your budget, is it, Mr. Ryan? You don't even count for that $74 billion.
This budget repeals the entirety of the Affordable Care Act.
But that's
so including, that's the 40-hour work week provision you're talking about.
Right.
This repeals that. I think Mr. Van Halen, he likes to interpret this differently.
Well, good. I'm
sure you should ask him because he'll give you the opposite of what
we call it the reality-based interpretation.
So you'll hear us about this on the floor a lot.
Something like that.
We call for revenue-neutral tax reform, which says swap out the current tax code with a revenue-neutral, more pro-growth tax code. And we think that all those Medicare savings, which were taken from Medicare to pay for the Affordable Care Act, should stay toward contributing to Medicare's solvency, and then we produce reserve funds to address provider issues that may arise, just like the doc fix. We call this the SGR, the doctor fix. We have these reserve funds so that we can address problems in the provider network that we think will result from the Affordable Care Act, like, say, Medicare Advantage. So what our budget does is it repeals the Affordable Care Act, does the other things I just said, and so that is included in our that bill you mentioned is included in it. The problem we have, Ms. Slaughter, is we haven't been able to get an estimate from the CBO for 2 years as to what the costs or savings are from repealing the Affordable Care Act. So we don't have reliable data on the entirety of it.
It goes up, so there is no savings.
It's a 2-year-old score, and we're 2 years into the 10-year window.
Well, but it's still arithmetic, Mr. Ryan.
No, I realize that. What I'm trying to say is when Obamacare was passed, it was 6 years of spending paid for with 10 years of Medicare cuts and tax increases. Now we're into 2014. It's a different fiscal climate, and we do not know now the answer to what the fiscal effects are if
But we do know the cost of health care, the rise in the cost of health care is the lowest it's been since 1950. We do know that, don't we?
Yeah, health inflation has gone down. That's predating the Affordable Care
Well, I think that there is a connection there. But, Mr. Van Hollen, there's nothing in here that creates jobs. I appreciate what Mr. Ryan said, that what we need to do is raise take-home pay. I hope that means that we're going to pass a minimum wage increase here, because that certainly is a sure way to do it, and to do it very quickly for people who desperately need it. But my cursory look over this, and I have not really gone into great depth on what it is, but what it says to me is that in order to maintain the tax cuts for the extraordinarily rich corporations and individuals in the United States, we are making college kids pay the interest rates on their loans while they're in school, taking away Head Start, no job programs that I'm aware of. In fact, they cut job training. Am I missing something here that
Yes.
some magical
Yes.
pay?
No, let me, if I might, Ms. Slaughter,
Yes,
since,
please, I'd like you to. Very
since
much.
Mr. Ryan has had the benefit of a couple of questions directed specifically at him, I'd like to take this opportunity to address some of the issues, starting with the point that you raised, which it's that you, whatever our analysis may be, the important analysis of the Congressional Budget Office, and the Congressional Budget Office says that this Republican budget will actually slow down economic growth in the next couple of years and reduce job growth in the next couple of years. And that's because relative to what was an imperfect but bipartisan short-term agreement, the Republican budget before us actually makes, as Mr. Rogers himself said, draconian cuts in vital investments in our country, so draconian that, in fact, it will slow down economic growth, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Now, if I could just address this issue of balance, because our Republican colleagues cannot claim two things at the same time. They cannot claim that their budget balances at the end of this 10-year window, and at the same time claim that they repeal the entire Affordable Care Act. And in fact, they do not repeal the Affordable Care Act, because if they do, they're $2 trillion short. So we've actually taken them at their word that on 53 occasions in this House, we've repealed the Affordable Care Act, that's their number one objective, right? Mm-hmm. Now,
the whole world knows
the whole thing. But now, this budget, the Republican budget, repeals all the benefits of the Affordable Care Act, right? It repeals the tax credits that help more people afford insurance in the exchanges. It repeals the provisions that let young people stay on their parents' insurance policy till the age of 26. It repeals the provisions that make sure that if you have a pre-existing condition, you're not rejected by the insurance companies. It gets rid of all of that. But embedded in it is $2 trillion of savings and revenue from the Affordable Care Act. And if you get rid of that, as they say they want to do in the same budget, their budget doesn't come close to balancing in 10 years. And the bill that you just raised from the floor of the House last week was the smoking gun. Because as soon as that bill passed the House, their budget was out of whack by $74 billion. And that's just a little piece of the Affordable Care Act. If you get rid of all $2 trillion in revenue and savings from the Affordable Care Act, their budget is way out of balance. So even after everything they do in this budget to impose a lot of austerity that I want to talk about on the American people, everyone except very wealthy interests, after all that, they're still not in balance if they're really repealing the Affordable Care Act. Now, if I could just highlight the really important point you made, which is that these budgets are about priorities, they're about values, they're about choices.
Morality.
They show what we care about, they show what we care less about. And despite all the talk from our Republican colleagues about the importance of achieving a particular deficit reduction goal in the out years, sort of ideological driven goal. Despite all the focus on that, they don't close one single special interest tax break for the purpose of reducing the deficit. Not one. Not a hedge fund tax break, not a big oil company tax break. They don't trim any of the deductions that disproportionately benefit the very wealthy. Not one. And because they choose to protect the powerful special interests and the very wealthy, they take it out on everybody else in the country in this budget. Let me just give you a couple of examples of the choices they make. While they're providing what amounts to a 30% cut in the top tax rate for millionaires, 30% from a 39% rate to a 25% rate, that's a 30% tax rate cut for millionaires. While they do that, they make huge cuts to our kids' education. Everything from early education and Head Start to K through 12 education to college education. Let me just give you one example from college. Our students have about $1 trillion right now in student loan debt. they would actually change the law to require that students be charged interest while they're still at college. That saves them about, I believe, $40 billion in their budget, a budget that doesn't ask for anything from those special interests. So that's in the area of education. In the area of maintaining commitments to our seniors, let me just tell you what their budget does. Number one, it reopens the prescription drug donut hole, right? Mm-hmm. So when we did the Affordable Care Act, we achieved some savings in Medicare by ending some of the overpayments to the private insurance companies, but we recycled some of those savings to improve the Medicare benefit. And we closed the donut hole. Their budget reopens the donut hole. That means for a senior who has high prescription drug costs, $1,200 additional per year on average. Their budget also now requires everybody to make co-payments to get preventative health care services. We had said that we want people to be able to access those services without cost because we wanted people to catch their symptoms early, and so we could resolve health care issues before they got worse. They reimpose those costs. They end the Medicare guarantee by going to a voucher plan, and we can talk more about that. We can talk more about that
I
later.
would like to talk more.
So that's on the seniors. I'd just like to get to the moral responsibility issue as well, because in addition to those devastating cuts in the areas I talked about, for the safety net that we have for people who are struggling, families who are struggling, and families that we hope we can help lift them out of poverty, who are trying to strive to get in the middle class, they absolutely devastate the safety net. We had a big debate in this House of Representatives on the Farm Bill about food nutrition programs. The Republican proposal at that time was $40 billion in cuts. We said that was absolutely irresponsible and unacceptable to put more vulnerable people at risk and more kids in hunger. So in the Farm Bill, that was reduced to $8 billion eventually. Still high, but it was reduced. This Republican budget, $135 billion cut to food and nutrition programs. And let me just say,
more than the...
That's right.
Oh,
so since the
more
issue...
than the Farm Bill cut.
That's right.
Okay.
So since the issue of moral responsibility was raised, I think it's important to note that in past Republican budgets, the leaders of faith communities have indicated in written testimony to this Congress that the Republican budget did not meet the tests of basic moral standards as measured by caring for the least of these.
And the farmers don't like it much.
And I will tell you, when it comes to some of these cuts, this Republican budget is the worst of the three I've seen. So, again, that all flows from choices that are made in this budget to protect special interest tax breaks, because if you combine that choice with an artificial political goal to hit an ideological end at the end of the 10-year window, if you start with that goal and you protect the very wealthy, everybody else in the country takes it in the stomach. And I just so I appreciate the opportunity just to respond to some of the points that the chairman raised. As we indicated at the outset, we have fundamental differences, but one of those differences is we call for shared responsibility for increased prosperity, not an austerity budget that hits everybody except for the very powerful and the very wealthy.
I think in my district, one of the things that worries people most is the vouchering of Medicare, and that we would send people out into the private market to try to find something they could afford, which really is really verges on cruel and unusual punishment to me for a lot of senior citizens who are physically and mentally unable to do that.
I have good news for you. I can clear up your misunderstanding of our proposal very quickly. Like we had before Obamacare, we got to choose among guaranteed programs as federal employees. This is similar to that. Premium support is how the Part D benefit works. So there's no voucher being given to anybody to go out and pick on your own what you want.
But they do have to go out on their own into the market. Is that correct?
So there are guaranteed coverage options, guaranteed, offered through Medicare, by private plans. More than a quarter of our seniors already do this right now through a program called Medicare Advantage. All seniors who have a Part D benefit do it the exact same way through the Part D benefit. And what we have learned is by giving seniors more choices, which under this plan you can either stick with the traditional fee-for-service program or take one of these comprehensive guaranteed programs for your benefit. They can't deny you care. We give people more aid if they're poor or if they're sick than we give the wealthy. And what we have shown is by giving seniors this choice, we are forcing the providers of healthcare services to compete for our business as beneficiaries versus turning the management of Medicare over to a 15-person board of unelected bureaucrats that Obamacare created called the Independent Payment Advisory Board, which is told to have arbitrary cuts, savings of which have tripled in the Obama budget, where they're going to ration and end up denying care for current seniors. We don't think the future of Medicare should be put up to 15 unelected bureaucrats that will make the decision on how senior citizens get their care. We think seniors should have the choice of choosing among guaranteed coverage options for their benefit, and we think we should subsidize more for low-income and sick people than for wealthy people.
Well,
we think that's the best way to save and strengthen Medicare.
I suppose it was just a propitious thing last night that 60 Minutes did an issue on people in a part of Virginia where they have no access to health care. And they had 2 trucks called the health wagons with nurses who had advanced training going around and kind of a circuit rider sort of thing and trying to give people health care. And the number of people who died of cancer because they were not diagnosed in time, not a single one of them had any kind of insurance and never expected they would ever be able to afford it. And Virginia, of course, is one of the states that will not expand Medicare to give those people. And a doctor made the most cogent remark about that. He said, this is a third world country in the United States. And Mr. Ryan, we can do better than that.
Oh, I sure agree with that.
Instead of trying to cut and save and do everything else in the world, it would be so nice if once we could all work together on something that really could help to move this country forward and meet the needs of the people and hope for some future. So I thank you.
Ms. Lott, if I could just briefly respond to the comments on their Medicare plan. The Congressional Budget Office looked at the plan that they're proposing. And determine that premiums for seniors who remain in the traditional Medicare program would go up by 50%.
That's not the case.
We'll show you the CBO report. And we don't think that that's preserving the existing Medicare guarantee. You have to pay to stay, and you have to pay big time. I think if you told the senior, don't worry, we're going to keep, the Medicare plan you're on, but you got to pay 50% more in premiums. Well, we'll get.
I have to show for the record that's just not accurate, and it's not an accurate reflection of our budget. So for the record, I want to say that.
Well, okay. Our understanding is that their budget was based on what they call the average bid model from the Congressional Budget Office, and that was the Congressional Budget Office
I'd be happy to elaborate
analysis.
on that, too.
But it will go up significantly, and we don't think that that's appropriate.
Mr. Ryan.
We can go back and forth if you'd like. I assume we will do this on the floor. Congressional Budget Office ran some simulations of what premium support systems could look like. Both are designs that they designed, which are not a reflection of our budget, but what they did show is that premium support works to improve competition and bring down costs. Bring down costs for beneficiaries, bring down costs for taxpayers. Our program, which I just sent a letter to the gentleman today, is using the idea of an average bid option, won't get too technical details, but designed differently, which would be something that the Ways and Means Committee would ultimately design how it would work. But what we believe and what CBO is telling us is if you give seniors more choices, if you give them guaranteed coverage options, not only will they be better off, and they get to choose what plan they want, the system's better off. Let me give you a case in point. When the Part D benefit for prescription drugs was passed and then implemented, it came in 40% below cost projections. Why did that happen? I mean, name me another government program that was designed that came in 40% below what was anticipated to cost. Why? Choice and competition. We trusted seniors. We didn't have 15 bureaucrats make their decisions for them or dictate terms and conditions to them. we trusted seniors to make choices in their best interest. Oh, and by the way, this starts in 2024, and it doesn't affect people who were born before 1959. So just so we're being clear about this, this debate we're having doesn't affect a person who is in or near retirement. And those of us who are years away from retirement, we don't have a solvent Medicare system for us when we retire. The trust fund, and Part A trust fund goes bankrupt in 2026. So let's think about, de-escalating the rhetoric, guaranteeing seniors have what they've planned their lives around, trying to make sure that those who are about to retire have the comfort of knowing government's going to make good on their promises. But in order to make good on those promises, we've got to fix it for the future so that we can cash flow the present. And unfortunately, if we keep whistling past the graveyard, if we keep racking up debt, and if we keep denying these reforms that are necessary to save these crucial programs, then that safety net will, in fact, be shredded, and that's what we're worried about.
Oh, and Mr. Ryan, you also mentioned loss of jobs. And talking about the bill last week. I haven't been able to find out any information that the affordable health care has caused any loss in jobs. Would you mind to share what you have?
Sure, I'll just cite, I won't even cite outside analyses. I'll cite Congressional Budget Office. Yeah. Congressional Budget Office, in their recent baseline, said that as a result of the Affordable Care Act, the equivalent of 2 million jobs will not be offered in the year 2017.
No, I'm not talking about what the
2.5 million jobs by 2024.
I'm talking about the people. My understanding of what you said was the number of people who have lost their jobs already. I'm
talking about just in the economy. People have been. You know that people are losing jobs in this economy, right?
Right. I'm talking about, it's really very nice to spar with you, but we're talking about affordable health care.
Would the gentlewoman yield?
Yes.
Yes. It might be possible if we talked about the employment level in the country right now to answer that.
Well, that's what I was saying earlier, which was
how many people do we have working now?
Let me reclaim my time. What I want to talk about here is in relation to the affordable health care. I'm not talking about companies moving away or companies doing all kinds of things or somebody lost their job. I want to know the ones that lost their job because of the health care.
Assurance in Milwaukee, one of our biggest employers in Milwaukee.
Any light on that?
Yeah,
hundreds of jobs in Milwaukee at Assurance.
So, since we're talking about the Congressional Budget Office analyses, the Congressional Budget Office looked at this and concluded there was absolutely no evidence that the Affordable Care Act had cost anybody their job.
They were looking for jobs. That's right.
That was my.
As a matter of fact,
John,
that was the finding of the Congressional Budget Office. So, in terms of reducing the rhetoric in the country and the temperature level, let's look at what the Congressional Budget Office had to say about that, and that's what they found.
Exactly. Have not jobs in health care been increased?
Well, as you know, we've been adding jobs every month. We'd all like to see faster job growth, but the reality is it's been steady. We can do better, and we think that the Republican budget plan will actually slow job growth in the next couple of years.
Thank you very much. Thank you both.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next time I'll take a later flight because I thought you'd be done with this sentence before. I know that we always talk about the looming deficit that we have, and the nice political response is always to say it took 7 decades to get us in this problem. It's going to take a lot of time to get us out of this problem. But the longer we put off actually addressing some of the key structural elements of this problem, the longer it's going to take to move out of that. And I realize it is very easy to pick at elements of the budget, especially when you're presenting an overall budget. I will, too, at the proper time. There are some parts of this in which I will disagree. But at the same time, I recognize that you're putting a framework to move forward, an overall framework. And in one respect, may I thank you for recognizing the need of our military readiness, which has been truly hampered by this administration. And if we do not do something significant in that area, that we are presenting ourselves in difficult times, both militarily and diplomatically in the future. I appreciate the fact the Budget Committee has recognized that. Haven't so gone as far as I'd like you to, but you have recognized it and made a major improvement in that. With that, I'll try and get us out of here for votes and yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both gentlemen for being here. And, Dr. Fox said that, we have a moral responsibility to our children. I think that's the first time I've ever agreed with her on anything in this committee, because I think we do. But where we disagree is whether or not the Ryan budget actually meets that test. I don't see the morality in cutting programs for early childhood development or WIC or education or Pell Grants. I don't know where the morality is in that. And I think, we talk about budgets and people throw numbers around and statistics, and EBO reports, on and on and on. But, we've almost kind of dehumanized the whole process so that we forget that behind these numbers are people, and people are not line items. And people, there are consequences to some of these cuts and some of these decisions. The Farm Bill was brought up by Mr. Van Hollen. I actually have the privilege of also sitting on the Agriculture Committee, and I complained in committee last week during a hearing that one of my problems with the way the Farm Bill was formulated was that I think the people who are in most need of attention, those in the middle and those struggling in poverty, never had a place at the table. I mean, we brought a Farm Bill before this committee to cut $40 billion, and there was never a single hearing. And in fact, there was not one person who was on SNAP, who was on any of these nutrition programs, was even asked to come before the committee. And my guess is that some of these beneficiaries were not asked to come before the Budget Committee or any other committee. I mean, the bottom line is that we're having these debates, and I think it doesn't reflect the reality outside this beltway. That poor people don't have a place at the table. Those struggling middle-income families don't have a place at the table. And we're all up here pontificating about how everybody's going to sacrifice. And I don't think anybody appreciates what it's like right now to live in this country and be on food stamps. The average benefit is $1.40 per meal per day. And it was a little bit better, but because of the cuts that we let go into effect in November, and now the cuts in the Farm Bill, which some of the governors are trying to fix, that number is what it is today. I mean, I don't know how people don't live on that. People, we talk about ladders of opportunity, and yet we're not providing people ladders of opportunity to become self-sufficient. This budget cut SNAP by $137 billion over 10 years. I mean, I find that stunning. I mean, it takes my breath away when I think about that, knowing what people in this country are going through right now. And the deal is, I've been listening to these debates and all these rationales about, well, we were creating a culture of dependency. Majority of people on this benefit who are able to work, and I'm not talking about senior citizens or children, but the majority of people who are able to work. They work. And yet they still earn so little, because our minimum wage is so low, that they still qualify for this benefit. And our answer to kind of balance the budget is let's go back after this program. We talk about efficiencies. Categorical eligibility was an efficiency that you guys thought of, Republicans thought of. John Kasich, that was his idea, to streamline the process, to cut expenses on states, to make it easier for people to qualify for what they qualify. Now it's a swear word up here, because we don't want people to be able to take advantage of these programs. So I'm all for, talking about morality, but I don't know how you say that this is a budget that meets the test of taking care of the least among us when it shreds the safety net. I mean, if you're hungry, you're going to see a $137 billion cut in SNAP. If you're rich, quite frankly, as Mr. Van Hollen pointed out, you might as well pop the champagne, because you're going to get a pretty good tax cut. And I understand, there's an argument to be made, well, these rich people get tax cuts and they will reinvest in the economy. But there's also a case to be made that by investing in things, you create opportunities. Now, I can tell you, I don't know of a governor in the country who isn't in need of help to rebuild their infrastructure. In Massachusetts, we have older bridges than most of your states, and they need repair.
States, yeah.
They need to be repaired. You know, I mean, we want to invest in mass transit. We want to. There are lots of things that need to be done all across this country. By investing in those things, you create jobs. You also create a climate where more business wants to locate because it's easier to do business in places where you can get in and out of. I mean, Mr. Van Hollen, I mean, maybe you can enlighten me on whether there's an increase in infrastructure investment in the Ryan budget, or.
I mean, I'm right here. I'd be happy to get into it if you'd like to.
Since you begin, you can go after Mr. Van Hollen.
The short answer is it's not contained in their budget numbers. No increase. They establish what's called a reserve fund. So, you know, Congress go figure out how you're going to pay for additional investments in transportation. Very unlike the President's budget, for example, or the alternative that we will propose, which actually provides in our budget funding revenue with respect to the Transportation Trust Fund. It's a particularly urgent issue because, as I think all of us know, later this summer, the trust fund is going to go insolvent, right? There will be no new starts. There's already a slowdown in work in some states on construction projects because of the uncertainty about whether the federal government will be there. The President's proposal is to create a 4-year investment in infrastructure, $302 billion, again, by closing some of these tax breaks that actually encourage companies to ship jobs overseas and invest those funds instead in jobs in our infrastructure here at home. And in that respect, our budget does the same thing. But no, the Republican budget does not include any funding for transportation in their budget numbers. If you look at their budget numbers, the assumption is that the thing will go insolvent unless Congress comes up with another proposal.
So, Mr. Ryan, how do we invest in our infrastructure?
Let me go back a couple of paces. Just to give you the full story on food stamps. Let's put that $137 billion number in perspective. We will still be spending $600 billion on food stamps over the next decade. This is a program that has quadrupled since 2002.
Well, let me time for 1 second. It's quadrupled in part because of unemployment has gone up.
But not
and also,
you know as well as I do, it's grown because of the bad economy, but not even because of the bad economy. It's grown beyond that because of increased eligibility. And so this is where we just have different
increased eligibility on a benefit that's on average $1.40 per meal per day.
So what we're suggesting is we just want people who qualify for food stamps to get food stamps.
Well, that's the way it is now.
No, that's not the case. With categorical eligibility, as you know, when you expand the eligibility of other programs, you're putting people into food stamps who otherwise wouldn't qualify for that.
If I can reclaim my time just to be accurate.
LIHEAP is the same story.
Well, if you qualify for other programs, you're automatically enrolled in SNAP. You don't automatically get it unless you qualify for the program. The issue with the LIHEAP is that you all thought that it should be at least a $20 state contribution before any of these people get an increase in their very measly food benefit, and so that's what we did here. And then states took money out of other programs, and now states, including Republican governor, are now saying, we don't want people to go hungry, so we did it, and you're all crying foul, as if it's like a terrible thing to help somebody struggling on SNAP. And by the way, majority of these people work. They work.
Okay, so that's the other point I wanted to make, which is we believe one of the successful ways of getting people out of poverty was the welfare reform in 1996. Now, I know you disagree with that. We've had this conversation before, but we believe that was very successful because it dramatically lowered child poverty rates. It dramatically increased single parents going into the workforce, and we thought it was a successful reform. They reformed one program, AFDC to TANF. We want to apply similar reforms to this program as well. And so the work requirement, with giving the governors the flexibility to tailor the food stamp benefits to meet the specific needs of their populations through a block grant, which will begin in 2019 after CBO says the economy will have recovered and unemployment will be 5.7%.
And
what we are suggesting is the work requirement occur for people who are able-bodied without dependents.
Right.
So if you're a person with kids,
right,
if you're elderly, if you're infirm, the work requirement doesn't occur to you. It occurs with able-bodied people without dependents after the year 2019, so that the governors can have the flexibility to customize the benefits to meet the needs of their states.
Governors ask for waivers because they recognize that, it's necessary.
But the governors get to decide.
Right. Well, they do. I mean, they decide now, and we don't force governors to do waivers. Governors, including Republican governors, request waivers. We don't force them. You all have to have waivers. They have to ask for waivers.
The point
we
is,
don't get them if they don't.
The best way out of poverty is a job.
Right. No.
And I want to do everything I can to get the able-bodied person into a job and out of poverty.
Can we clear my time? Last week I spent a night in a homeless shelter in Worcester, Massachusetts. It's a homeless shelter for families. All these families work. All right, they all work.
Then this wouldn't.
They earn. I got to give you kind of one of the challenges that we face here. That I think this is why cutting these benefits doesn't make any difference. We ought to be figuring out ways, quite frankly, to continue some of these benefits for a little while longer, because these people earn. These people earn just a little bit too much to qualify for some of the state-funded shelter programs, but they don't earn enough to be able to pay their rent. Because they earn a little bit more, their food stamp benefit gets reduced.
There's where I'll agree with you.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
So the deal. So we were talking about this stuff. Late into the evening, and for the their whole issue is even before they got a job and they were on SNAP, their benefit didn't even cover the month. I mean, they were in church halls and in food banks, and synagogues and mosques trying to find food to get through the month for their kids.
Right.
So we're having a debate here, and this is why I go back to what I said before. We ought to have people who are on the benefit come before us to testify, not so-called experts or theorists or people who. I mean, we've kind of walled ourselves in, and my problem with what we're talking about here is that it I guess if I'm just writing out numbers, maybe it makes this. I could it's even hard with that to find the logic, but this is more than about that. So, but going back to transportation.
I wanted the transportation, but
tell me how we're going to.
You and I share some ideas on how the benefits tapered and the marginal tax rate a person is hit with when they're trying to get out of poverty. That's a conversation I would really like to have with you. But in the interest of time, we won't do it here. Okay, so what we do is basically what Chris said. It's important to know that the transportation baseline has a huge cut coming. And so we have this cliff we're walking into that we'll have to address, I would think, before the August recess.
You propose a tax increase?
So just like we did 2 years ago with MAP 21, the Budget Committee, we're not going to take over the jurisdiction of the Transportation Committee and tell them how to write a transportation bill. So what we have done in this budget is created a reserve fund which gives us the legislative vehicle and the ability to bring the Transportation Committee's solution to this problem to the floor, just like we did 2 years ago when we did MAP 21, which prevented this cliff from occurring. That moved it out 2 years. We got the cliff coming again. The baseline simply reflects that cliff. We don't want that baseline cliff to occur. The budget simply reflects the baseline, but it gives the Transportation Committee the tools they need to bring a solution to the floor, which quite frankly, hasn't been identified.
So there's no new investment in transportation that you're calling for in this budget?
No, we're just following the baseline, and we're saying this is a problem that needs to be fixed. We're not going to take over another committee's jurisdiction and tell them how to fix it. They need to come up with a solution, and we've given them the means to bring that solution to vote so we can fix this before it gets too late.
Mr. Van Hollen?
Well, the point I would make, Mr. McGovern, is, that didn't stop the Budget Committee from telling the Ways and Means Committee to cut the top tax rate to 25%.
On a revenue-neutral basis, which
or do a premium support plan or voucher. But I guess, look, if we're going to solve this problem, we should show it in our budget. And if you look at this budget, the one that's before this committee, it does not take into account any of the costs we're going to face from fixing this problem, right? So whatever is in their spending line, it does not include 1 penny to address the insolvency that's looming in August.
Because we like to operate on our budget, and we think that you need to budget for these things, and we won't just borrow more money to fix our fiscal problems. We need to make choices and priorities. If this is a problem, we need to reprioritize spending to address that problem.
What about National Institutes of Health? What is?
That's up to the Appropriations Committee.
I mean, with obviously a major reduction in overall spending.
This doesn't.
Well, no, I mean,
that's up to the Appropriations Committee.
No, I know, but you go below sequester numbers, right?
Well, look, let me just say this is always a little bit of the shell game that's played in this budget, with all due respect.
Well,
because here's what they do. Here's a fact. I don't think this will be contested. Their budget cuts the non-defense discretionary portion of the budget by $790 billion more than the sequester over the next 10 years. Now, relative to the Murray-Ryan agreement, which was imperfect but was a compromise, they will cut that part of the budget compared to current services there by 24% over the 10-year period. 24%. That is 40% below the lowest that part of the budget has been as a share of the economy since the 1950s. If you look at a chart, it's like that, which is why Harold Rogers said it was draconian. I mean, anyway, and so if they're going to say they're not going to cut NIH by 24%,
that's correct.
Okay, then you tell us what else you're going to cut by more than 24%.
And the reason why I asked the question is because we all had we heard from NIH directly as a result of the sequester, about the lost research and the lost jobs and the lost opportunities. I'm just curious.
Yes. So after 2016, even he's spending still.
And by the way, we really do need to increase our spending on NIH.
To give you a sense of this budget and all of this rhetoric, the current baseline, the current budget, just left on autopilot, will grow by 5.2% a year for the next decade. This awful, draconian, hardcore budget, whatever the rhetoric you choose to use, increases spending by 3.5% over the next 10 years. So we're not even talking about cutting here. We're talking about, I just want to say the big picture here is instead of increasing spending at 5.2% a year and then never balancing the budget, this budget increases spending at 3.5% a year over the next 10 years, which is how we can get to a balanced budget so that we're not continuing to spend our children and our grandchildren's spending today that they have to pay back.
And I always close with this. Here's just one thought about how we might be able to kind of get our budget under control. Again, with increased investments in NIH, you find a cure to Alzheimer's disease. Medicaid will not have a problem. Let's find a cure to diabetes. Let's find a cure to some more cancers.
So we should prioritize that.
That's how we do it.
And so we should prioritize that.
What I hear from researchers, just so you know, and you hear the same thing, is that China, even Singapore, are now trying to lure our researchers away, because they're offering them better investments on research. I want those cures to be found here. I want those jobs here. I want our people to benefit from these drugs and from these miracle cures. That's one of the ways you kind of balance the budget. So, I understand the cutting stuff, but sometimes investments also result in long-term savings. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that. Anyway, I look forward to listening to the debate on the floor. I'll hold my breath.
You're getting a favor of it here.
And I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Oklahoma, the gentleman, Chairman Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I suspect, like my friend Mr. Woodall, who probably stepped out, we've heard this debate. So I'm not going to take a lot of time, but I do want to make a couple of points. First, I want to tell you how pleased I am that you did bring the budget forward, Mr. Chairman, because I think had you not done that, Senate, we know, is not going to do that. And with all due respect, I don't think our friends on the other side of the aisle would have done that, because in 2010, when the positions were reversed, they did not bring out a budget during an election year. The only reason why we're having this discussion, however you come down on it, is because you've had the courage to put out something on the floor or in the committee and through the process that's going to be attacked, but it's going to cause a discussion this country really needs.
That's what we think.
To take it. My friends are concerned about a transportation trust fund that's going broke. So am I. But I'm a lot more concerned about a Social Security trust fund and a Medicare trust fund. They're growing broke very rapidly because the scale is astronomically different, and the immediate impact on lives, if we reach that point, is much, much greater. And the only reason why we're, again, having much of a discussion on this is because Mr. Ryan has been willing to engage in that discussion. And again, I do want to thank my friend Mr. Van Hollen, because evidently you're going to engage as well. And I think that's really important for us as a country. But absent Chairman Ryan, I don't think you would have been engaging on your own. So I'm going to give him a little more credit. Second thing is I want to thank you because you focus where you need to focus. I'd say this is an appropriator. I mean, we've borne the brunt of this more than anybody else. We are spending $165 billion less than we spent in 2008 in the discretionary budget, so we've kind of done our share. But we've got to deal with entitlements, and we can discuss a lot of ways to do it. But again, I haven't seen out of the president any serious discussion about. There's been some change CPI last year, but taken away this year. Higher age for retirement at one point, then that's taken off the table. I think the last thing we have left is a little bit of means testing in his budget, which is a good thing. I appreciate that. But most other people have shied away from talking about what we all know the real drivers of the debt are. You haven't. And I think you've pushed, pulled, and persuaded our party to move in the right direction. I think that's a big deal. I do want to ask one area that we did not get into, a relatively small area, but I think it's an important one, and I say this from an appropriator standpoint, just simply trying to have certainty in the appropriations and the budgeting process. We were set to have a discussion over wildfire suppression and its cost. Mr. Simpson has a bill, which I think is a good bill. The President has a proposal, which is actually quite similar to that. And I've been advised the CBO now says there's no scoring issue here. That's what evidently they said on Friday, I've been told. So
that would be news to me then.
Fair enough, but I think you might want to look at that, because I'm told, and I may be wrong because it wasn't told to me, but I was told by Mr. Simpson that they see no score here. So
this is an issue that needs to get fixed. It's a very legitimate problem. Wildfires end up consuming the base Forest Service budget. And so we want to get ahead of that, and we want to try to pre-fund our wildfire accounts for fire prevention. Fire prevention, by the way, is the key to this. We've got to harvest some trees so we can have healthier forests so we don't have catastrophic fires. That's a policy statement, but I would argue that that's important policy. Where we had an issue was a discrepancy between how the Congressional Budget Office looks at this and how OMB looks at this, which is the way we call the DERF measures this. The emergency fund for emergencies, the disaster relief fund, has about $12 billion set aside for it. That $12 billion is not recorded as a score. It's what the Appropriations Committee chooses to fund in there when we have emergencies. That's what gets scored. If new things can be put into the disaster relief fund, then that will have the practical result of overall increasing discretionary spending, and that is how Congressional Budget Office has claimed that this is going to be a cost.
I understand the point, and it's a legitimate point, but I will just tell you the practical reality.
Right.
Because it's not just the Forest Service budget. It's the entire interior budget. So when you don't fund it, I mean, cutting Indian health care on reservations for kids is not a very good way to fight fires, that occur in rich neighborhoods in California. I lost, in one case a number of years ago, actually my second or third year, we had a series of wildfires in the West. They needed to fight them. I got it. So they canceled a visitor center that was scheduled over many years, their discretionary to be built in a national park. Fair enough that fire was much more immediate, but we've never gotten back to that. So, I mean, this makes it extraordinarily difficult. The sheer nature of emergencies means you can't predict them. You can budget up to a certain point for them. You can use 10-year averages, but once you crack that, we were within 60 days.
Therein lies the issue.
My point. I'll let you finish.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
We were within, and Sandy relief, no Sandy, we would have finished the year with $6 billion surplus. You have a catastrophic event in Sandy, you're not going to not fund it. But you can't also, on something that size, go back and upset every other budget in the discretionary branch. You just can't live that way. So
this is similar to the conversation that he and I have, where we typically agree on war funding, which is you don't want base budget spending going into emergency spending, and so that's the CBO concern here, which is if you underfund fire prevention, only fund 70% of the 10-year average instead of 100% of the 10-year average, you're effectively underfunding it in the base budget, and then you're going to encouraging emergency funding to go on top of that, which will have the
again, I understand that, but had we, and I would agree with you. I mean, let's take a 10-year average number. Had we done that, it still wouldn't have taken care of Sandy.
I'm not suggesting it would have, but I think that's where the concern here is. by the Congressional Budget Office.
Well, all I'm urging is that we continue to
Yeah.
look at it and work.
That I
with it,
agree with.
because I don't think we've been doing
It's
it.
a problem that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, and it is causing a lot of havoc. But I find myself very much in the same position as my friend to my right, the good gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop. This is a framework. I don't have to agree with every
that's
single
right.
item in it. And the reality is, absent your framework, we wouldn't have had a framework by anybody other than the administration, which gives us a budget that never balances and ignores the main drivers of the debt. We wouldn't be having that discussion that is looking at the drivers of the debt. And frankly, I don't think we would have made some of the progress we've made in recent years in at least making some steps in the right direction on the deficit. So I applaud what you're doing and look forward to supporting on the floor. But I applaud you too, Mr. Holland. But thank you for bringing a Democratic alternative. I mean, I'm anxious to see it. I really am.
I can read it off to you if you'd like.
Yeah.
I won't. I'll spare you. But on the welfare, this is something that needs to be addressed. I agree with that, and I look forward to working with you.
The one other item I would ask you, and I think we have taken care of this, so I just mentioned this for the record. We are sequestering re-looms next year. I suspect we're going to have some sort of large deal relatively early next year between whatever the constellation of powers that be is after the election. But when that arrangement comes, if sequester should continue in some form, let's make sure that since we tried to exempt most health care programs from it, that the Indian Health Service, which is largely discretionary, should not have been hit.
Should not have
was during sequester.
That's right.
And it was simply something that everybody missed, but I want to make sure that never happens again. They ought to be under exactly the same conditions as everybody else is operating, not asking for any special treatment, just the same treatment. And you'll work with us on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right about that.
Appreciate that. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. It's time the gentleman, Judge Hastings.
Thank you very much,
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Van Hollen and Mr. Ryan, thank you. Each time I hear the two of you and other budgeteers, I'm always impressed that you know your subjects, and I'm deeply appreciative of that. I echo the sentiments of my colleague from Oklahoma. I do applaud you, Mr. Ryan, for putting out a budget. I venture a prediction that when the framework, if it's ever filled in, we won't be voting on it. So I guess it's just what we're going to do Thursday and then call it a day. I recognize that what I'm about to say now is purely anecdotal reference, what I like to call, and that's sort of inside the Rules Committee baseball, the Hastings Obamacare measure. I was this morning at George Washington Hospital at the faculty office for a medical visit with a physician named Farah Siddiqui. I've been not only to her, but on that third floor 7 times in the last year. At no time, no matter the time that I went, and it was always either early morning, 10 or 11 o'clock as today, at no time did I see more than 15 people. I counted them today after Dr. Siddiqui talked with me. It just struck me that a lot of people were there. But after she spoke with me regarding the increase that they have experienced since the Affordable Health Care Act went into existence, I went back out, and as I was offering up my copay, I counted the people that were there. There were 61 people. Dr. Siddiqui informed me that many of those persons, not before I went out, but that many people that they are seeing now, they are seeing for the first time, and they have to work them up. And she attributes some of it to Medicaid and the people that are qualified for it who never had insurance before. She went on to say that her uncle may very well wind up as a poster child for some State of the Union message. He didn't have insurance and had never been sick a day in his life. And he got insurance, and his first visit, they detected that he had cancer. He's now receiving treatment for it, and I'm proud of the fact and said to her that now he can't be kicked off his insurance. You made the statement earlier, Mr. Ryan, that in the Affordable Care Act, or the Hastings-Obamacare Act, that you didn't want 13 bureaucrats making 15 bureaucrats making medical decisions. I tend to agree with that, but I also know the harsh reality before the Affordable Health Care Act, where there were thousands of bureaucrats in insurance companies making decisions regarding whether or not a person had needs for medical attention of a certain kind. I also admire the fact that you guys, and I guess for the next 3 days, I'm fortunate to have a lot of appointments and will only come to the floor for votes because y'all get in the weeds. And the fact of the matter is Jane Lunchbucket and Ms. Johnson don't know what the hell you're talking about. And somehow or another, we need to be able to translate some of what we do here so that they can understand. I'm for taking all our pain and doing so as quickly as possible to balance the budget. And I don't believe in dynamic scoring and out-year approaches to budgeting. And I'm not on the budget committee, nor have I ever been, nor do I desire to be. But the fact of the matter is, I believe if we, as a body, did a 2-year real budget, that we might stand a better chance of avoiding that walk past the cemeteries or whistling past the cemetery. Yes, that whistling past the cemetery that you aptly described. Mr. Scott is fond of saying and asking us, what is middle class? And he has asked several of us that, and I've been in his presence when he's done it, and he gets 3 or 4 answers. I'd be interested to know what each of you describe from the standpoint of basic income of individuals that are middle class. What amount of money is considered to be middle class? Mr. Ryan?
I think it depends on where you live. I don't think you can put a dollar on it.
All right.
I mean, look, in Janesville, Wisconsin, the cost of living is a whole lot different than it is here in Washington, D.C.
Well, what's middle class in Janesville?
I think where I would define it as quality of life more than quantity of income.
All right.
Are you above poverty? Are you above just treading water? And are you able to, save for your future? Are you able to provide for your kids? Are you able to set aside some for college? Are you able to possibly take a vacation? Are you saving for your retirement? Are you in a job where you are advancing yourself and advancing your family?
All right.
Versus slipping farther and farther behind because you're in poverty, and every day you go to work, you're actually not getting ahead.
That's a good description without a number, and I guess, as you put it, it's impossible to put a number on the difference between New York and the Delta in Mississippi in terms of cost. But the public perceives a number somewhere along the line. Mr. Van Hollen, what do you do with that question?
Well, actually, it's an area of agreement with the chairman.
Right.
I mean, I do think that it's a question of whether you're able to achieve a certain level of economic security that makes sure that you can afford a decent home over your head and make sure your kids can take advantage of the opportunities out there.
Mr. Scott is here, so now he has his answer, but he's still going to ask us for numbers when he asks the question. Let me come at it a different way. What numbers do each of you use for persons who are in poverty, and specifically, what numbers do you attach to children that are in poverty today?
We just go to the BLS and use their official poverty rates. The government has those. So there are different poverty benchmarks, but it's the official poverty rate, which is 15.1% right now, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Deep poverty, which is half the official line, is the highest on record since we've recorded it. Child poverty is also a statistic that BLS, Bureau of Labor
Would you accept 5 million?
this. So
5 million?
I don't. What's that?
They say 5 million, I read somewhere.
I don't recall what their latest number is.
Mr. Van Hollen, you have any information on that?
In terms of the poverty How many people are in poverty, or at what dollar level someone is considered in poverty?
How many people are in poverty?
Oh, it's actually it's close to 50 million people.
15 million.
50.
50
But
million.
I would say that I do think it's important to understand that the poverty programs that have been put in place since the 1960s also mean that 40 million people are not in poverty today. That was a recent finding by the Council of Economic Advisors. I think it's important because those 40 million people are not in poverty because of some of the things that we're talking about in these budgets. And if without those economic safety nets, you'd have.
Do you accept the number that today there are at least 5 million children in poverty?
Yes, I think.
All right. Mr. McGovern, you think it's more?
No, there are 17 million children in this country who are hungry.
Yeah.
So
All right.
that's,
I think the numbers.
All right. Let me ask, do both of you agree that there are more unemployed Americans than there are jobs available to them, factoring in skills and what matches skills? You both agree with that? Then
Yes, which is, if I could just say, which is one of the reasons we, in our alternative budget, our Democratic budget, we make sure that we fund the emergency unemployment compensation because those people are out there looking for work and can't find it for the reasons you said.
I read somewhere or heard you say, Mr. Ryan, somewhere, that this budget is just a part of a vision. And I don't attribute all of this to you. We call it the Ryan budget, but you've had discussions with your colleagues, either from the Republican Study Group, even Mr. Van Hollen. In your exchanges, I'm sure that something comes out that you all agree with. But if it is your vision, there's a song now popularized by a fellow stolen from somebody else called Blurred Vision. Robin Thicke sings that song. And that's how I perceive, without the words of the song, the vision as put forward. I want to commend to both of you and all of my colleagues a book that's been out in the last month and a half by Terry Galway, Machine Made. The Machine Made. The references are mostly to the development and sustaining of Tammany Hall. I thought I knew something about Tammany Hall, having lived during the Second World War in Jersey City and Newark, and remembering the discussions that were had. But I learned a whole whale of a lot, and particularly I left just a little bit of it from a chapter called The Great Hunger. I'm sure, certainly you, Mr. Ryan, and Ms. Slaughter, being of Scotch and Irish heritage, remembers that in 1845, the terrible tragedy struck Ireland, and many of the persons that came to America thereafter and a few before were referred to in very negative terms as immigrants. And it became, at some point, Bishop John Hughes coined the phrase famine immigrants, and Daniel Moynihan used that often. In this book, it's recited that the Irish people themselves understood how powerless they were and how much their survival depended on the powerful. In quoting, "The potato crop is much worse than last," wrote James Pendergast, a farmer in County Kerry in 1846. "We expect good measures from the British Parliament this year, but we must wait to know the issue." Pendergast's expectations were dashed, and he would not survive the famine. His children immigrated to the United States. This sense of powerlessness in the face of disaster traumatized the Irish on both sides of the Atlantic. When faced with the ultimate sense of powerlessness, they could not feed themselves. They found government to be aloof, unsympathetic, and judgmental. Skipping ahead, not quoting Moynihan, who spoke of the famine immigrants previous to this comment, reformers and civic elites who sought to bring down immigrant constituents and their machines, whether through criminal prosecutions, outright disenfranchisement, or moralistic reform campaigns, unwittingly invoked in Irish American politicians and their constituents famine memories of powerlessness, of state power mobilized on behalf of the propertied and the privileged. Next chapter deals with Bishop Hughes, who played a tremendous role in a number of things, including something similar to charter schools. But he had a pretty good grip on all these things. The British government did not simply throw up its collective hands. Even if God's judgment was involved, government soup kitchens fed 3 million a day in the summer of 1847, and an extraordinary administrative and logistical effort. By the end of the year, however, London shifted the burden of paying for relief to Irish landlords, in essence leaving the Irish to devise their own solution to the catastrophe. And quoting a man named Trevelyan's words, they know how to discriminate between the different claims for relief. Fast forward to today, giving the money to states in block grants. I don't want to bore my colleagues with all of this, but I do lift something that I will take with me forever. I didn't know much about Al Smith. I heard lots of jokes at the meetings where they invoke his name and his running for office. But Al Smith's mother left Ireland just before the famine, so she would not have experienced the catastrophe firsthand. But Smith developed a view of political power that challenged the assumptions of the transatlantic free trader who believed the government had no role to play in ameliorating the inequities of the market. There were, Smith said, two distinct approaches to the use of state power. And I quote him, and I will quote him a lot, even to the point that it will become a mantra, as my colleague from Florida likes to refer to some of my comments. One group believes that the Constitution and statute law is intended only for the protection of property and money. The other group believes that law in a democracy is not divine principle, but exists for the greatest good, for the greatest number, and for meeting the needs of present-day society. That's what Al Smith said. And he said, that is the theory I hold, and that is the theory that L.C. Hastings holds with reference to ongoing matters in our society. And when we continue to talk about, I visited my grandchild in Silver Spring yesterday, and my daughter and her husband, and I looked at Zola and I thought that I would be hearing today that we were spending her money. And I just wondered who spent our mama's money and who spent mine, and who spent my daddy's and my granddaddy's money. Because what we were dealing with in different times, and this is why what you are proposing ain't going to work. I'm not talking about on paper and around here, but we don't know what the hell's going to happen 40 years from now. We don't know what's going to happen 10 years from now. But we do know that today we have the number of people that are unemployed that I pointed to and you agreed upon. We have the number of children that are in poverty. We have situations where children are not going to school at predominantly black and Latino colleges. Their rates are down because of the circumstances surrounding Pell Grants that this institution, Congress writ large, with the Senate and the rest of us, propounded, so is how we caused that deterioration to take place. We also know that we have an enormous number of people in prison in this society. perhaps more than should be. We also know that, as you put it, that people are getting older and more people are entering 10,000 a day into what is referred to as the baby boomers. And I can't believe that the men and women in this institution, 441 strong, and in the U.S. Senate 100 strong, cannot put aside some of our interests and get to the core of what's needed in order to address the inadequate circumstances that exist in the inseparable triumvirate in this country of inadequate jobs, inadequate housing, and inadequate educational opportunity. It comes right down to that. That's what Bishop Hughes spent a lot of his life fighting about. That's what a lot of people felt that were Irish immigrants. And I met some of them along the way when I was in second and third grade. We lived on the same streets. We shared, and Miss Slaughter and I, only ones here that really saw it, we shared the sacrifice. We had little bitty blue slips for black pepper and little bitty red ones for salt. We had blue slips or other things for gasoline and shoes. When is this society going to get around to wanting to do something for the greatest good, for the greatest number? And your budget, Mr. Ryan, does a whole lot for a few and too much left out for the many. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized. The gentleman who also shares time on behalf of the Rules Committee as my designee to the gentleman, Mr. Ryan, and the Budget Committee. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to serve on the Budget Committee. I'll be brief, but I can't let my colleague from Florida leave with the misunderstanding that my chairman on the Budget Committee doesn't internalize these very difficult decisions he makes. I take issue with what Mr. McGovern said earlier. He said there are consequences to some of these cuts and to some of these decisions. I would tell you there are consequences to all of these decisions. And the chairman and the ranking member grapple with those absolutely every single day, not in some sort of academic way, but in a real life way. And I would say to my friend from Florida, you encouraged us to take all of our medicine today. There are only two budgets that have been offered in this budget process this time around that come anywhere close to a balanced budget, either by reducing spending or by raising taxes to infinity.
You need to look at the CBC.
We need to continue to. I have examined it, and we need to continue to drive that train. I just have one question for Mr. Van Hollen. There's no question that reducing spending.
Just a moment, please. I believe that there are about 3.5 minutes left in the vote to answer the question from the panel. Thank you very much. Gentleman is recognized.
How many members have not? You've not voted either, right?
Excuse me just a moment, please.
Got it.
Excuse me just a moment, please. I do intend for us to continue until such time as it's very apparent that we need to leave, so I will not have anyone miss a vote. And I thank the gentleman. Gentleman, Mr. Woodall is recognized.
Mr. Van Hollen, clearly reducing government spending in the front years reduces some inputs into the economy. I believe that increases outputs in the out years. Is that a source of agreement that we have that reducing spending early may have negative economic impacts in year one, but would have positive economic impacts in year 10?
Well, there's no doubt that if you take the kind of reductions, at least in this particular economy right now, that it would create a drag on the economy. In the out years, there's no doubt that when you go back to full employment, the economy is humming on all things. To the extent you're reducing deficits, you're reducing the crowding out impacts. I would stress, however, that the CBO has said, including its analyses of both the Republican budget and other budgets, that they don't evaluate the policies for achieving that. As you pointed out, you can get there through revenues or cuts or some combination of the two. We've always proposed what we call a balanced approach to getting there.
Though the balanced approach that you are proposing in your substitute doesn't get us to a balanced budget, it invests more, presumptively because of the down economy. Is it obvious to you as you look at those numbers, if you remain as ranking member or chairman, in which year we would be able to introduce a balance?
In the 10-year window, ours dramatically reduces the deficits. We begin to reduce the debt as a percentage of the economy. We do a 10-year projection, as does the CBO. Again, I would argue strongly, Mr. Woodall, that it's a fact that if you get rid of the Affordable Care Act revenue and savings, the Republican budget is not in balance. We project it's a deficit of about 1.6% of GDP in year 10.
But to Mr. Hastings, a suggestion that we do whatever the tough decisions are today to get to balance as soon as possible, not possible using the balanced approach that you propose in a 10-year window.
We believe the ultimate objective, the priority of budgets, should be to promote economic growth, pro-growth policies, as well as job policies. That is the paramount concern. As you may recall, the Republican budget 3 years ago, I don't think hit balance until the year 2039. So at least at that point in time, the priority of the Republican budget was not to hit balance within an artificial 10-year window. So we think picking 10 years is a political artificial target that comes at the expense of the important investments we're talking about.
I would just quickly say we have a difference of opinion about what it takes to grow the economy. His budget proposes another tax increase of $1.8 trillion, proposes to raise or borrow more spending, $740 billion. The deficit is $637 billion at the end of the budget window under their budget. So we just have a different opinion on what it takes to grow the economy. We think that borrowing and taxing and spending has been tried a lot and has not succeeded, and we don't think it's the secret sauce to growing the economy. And we just have a difference of opinion.
I think it was my friend from Florida who said he didn't know why we went through these exercises, that nothing ever comes of it anyway, and it'll be over at the end of this week. But I will tell you, because of your leadership, we have conversations here that they used to teach me in college we could never have in the U.S. House of Representatives, and I'm grateful to you for your leadership on that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chairman, yields back time. I just noticed to all members, we have a little bit over 200 members that have not voted yet, so I'll run down that number and keep an eye on it. The gentleman from Florida is recognized. Gentleman, Mr. Nugent.
I just want to echo some of the comments were made on this side of the aisle, and particularly about bringing a budget forward. I mean, it would have been a lot easier to say, we're just not going to do that. Why take the political heat for it? Why take any slings and arrows that are shot at us? That would have been the easy way out, in my estimation. Because in the reality of it is, you know, we're sitting here with $17 trillion in debt. I don't know what the debt load is that America can withstand, but
we're testing it.
I think we're testing it. And, you know, from all the arguments about spending more money and, you know, on infrastructure and doing all these things and giving more money to people that presumably need it, but at what cost at the end of the day?
Yeah, that's what I think this debate misses so many times. When people say, you know, we're just not spending enough here, we're not spending enough there, or if we don't spend as much as others have proposed, that it's some draconian cut, when we're actually still increasing spending on things, just not at the pace that others would prefer. And we're doing this in order to make sure that we don't have this debt, in order to, see, we don't see the balancing the budget as some exotic ideological fascination or fixation. We see balancing the budget as a necessary means to an end, the end being lowering and paying off the debt so the next generation has a fresh start at life, so that they don't have to pay our bills when we retire. That's what's unique about this. And it's something that we've done in this country quite a bit. Look, I'm a product of the Irish famine immigrants. I'm very familiar with what he was talking about. And I was taught in my Irish Catholic family, Nell Smith was the first Catholic nominee, that you leave the next generation better off, that you make sacrifices in your generation so that the next generation is better off. And collectively as a country, we're not doing that. We are, as a country, running up the tab, living beyond our means, so that the next generation will have to necessarily live below their means. We don't think that's right. And oh, by the way, what the CBO is telling us is if we get this under control, we'll actually grow the economy faster, and people will have more take-home pay and more jobs. So we think that's a good thing. That's why we're doing what we're doing.
And, you know, Mr. Ryan, and you've been to my district.
A couple of times.
A couple of times. I represent 200,000 people that are currently on Social Security and Medicare. 200,000. That, if this changes dramatically for them, some obviously won't be here just because of their age, but there's so many more that will be. How are they going to live if their Medicare is cut dramatically because of what the law requires? And what happens on Social Security when those payments are reduced? How do they live?
Yeah, well, the law requires a 25% across-the-board benefit cut on all Social Security payments when the trust fund is exhausted, when we've run out of IOUs. That's that on Social Security. and Medicare, I can give you chapter and verse on it, but the point is the trust fund for Part A goes bankrupt in 2026. IPAB starts cutting by the end of the decade, that's the 15 bureaucrats I was talking about. And so we're basically taking not only medical care and control of it away from our seniors as they have it today, we're taking the control of Medicare away from Congress, their elected representatives, and giving it to 15 unelected appointed bureaucrats. We think that takes the critical care of health care for seniors in the exact wrong direction. We want to guarantee those in and near retirement get what they've planned on, and that those of us who are younger can actually be in control of our health care instead of taking it out of the control of our elected representatives and sending it to some distant bureaucrat.
Well, like I said earlier, it would have been easier for a whole lot of us, obviously, if we didn't have a budget. And you heard those arguments.
These are difficult times. We need to lead and show the country how we think we can fix these problems before they get out of our control.
And that's the one thing I guess that frustrates me the most about this job is that collectively, we'd much rather kick the can down the road. That's an old cliche, but we'd much rather do that because it's simpler and if we can get past today, we'll worry about tomorrow or later on. But we don't do anybody any favors by doing it that way. And I would suggest that we need even more frank talk about how do we actually preserve for those that actually have worked and have earned their retirement and Social Security, and Medicare, how do we preserve that so it is there?
Jim, yield.
I would, absolutely. And I'll wind up with that. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I'd like to notify all members that I would like to go ahead and have us go down and vote. I'd like to ask both of our visitors to please come back. I'd like to ask that our remaining members, I recognize there are three very distinguished members of this Rules Committee, that they would confine their remarks to 5 minutes in the dialogue so that our guests who've been here for a long, long time would have a chance to come back for only 15 minutes, and I would ask that they would do that. I'm sure I'll be met with some bit of a conversation. The committee is now in recess, pending the call of the chair, which will be immediately after the last vote. thank you very much. I appreciate Mr. Ryan coming back, and I would go to the gentleman from Colorado. Mr. Post, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. Mr. Cardenas, I have offered an amendment to your budget that would include H.R. 15 or comprehensive immigration reform, which would generate $200 billion during a 10-year scoring period. I'd like to know how you would like to divide that $200 billion between additional deficit reduction or accelerated deficit reduction, restoring some of the cuts proposed in your budget, and additional tax cuts with that additional $200 billion that we have basically handed you on a silver platter.
Appreciate the offer. As you know, that's a commitment. That's an amendment that's made in order in committee, but amendments like that are not, as you know, made in order on the floor. Only full substitutes are. The Budget Committee is not in charge of writing immigration law. That is the purview of the Judiciary Committee and the Homeland Security Committee. We did not feel it was appropriate to write immigration law in the Budget Committee. More to the point, we're of opinion on that actual bill.
Well, I mean, you're responsible for the budgetary implications of immigration reform, and I know that in the past you've certainly expressed support for it.
That's another issue entirely. And I think, given where labor markets are going and what immigration does to improve those labor markets, I do believe that immigration reform is good for economic growth, and it produces effects.
And that is not currently included in your current budget, is that correct?
That's correct.
And if it was included, again, all the versions that have been scored have had positive fiscal impact. I think it's fair to say that immigration reform that this body would do would have a positive fiscal impact.
What would we do with it? I would love to know. I think, look, faster economic growth, for instance, last year's CBO baseline versus this year's CBO baseline would go to the bottom line and help us balance the budget faster and pay off the debt faster. We don't have the rules right now in place to, say, use that for taxes. We could, but
would you be open to using some of that for tax cuts?
you'd have to change the rules.
Okay.
We propose revenue-neutral tax reform.
Would you be open to using some of it for restoring some of the cuts?
Budgets are priorities, so if you...
it would accelerate the path to balancing the budget.
Yeah, Congress would have to exercise its judgment on if they had a better baseline, meaning more revenue coming in. You could do any number of things, whether it's reducing taxes, whether it's doing more spending in an area, or just having faster deficits.
Have you also had the chance to examine the impact of immigration reform on entitlement programs like Social Security?
Not lately, no, I haven't.
Okay, and there have been some additional studies, which we'll be happy to get to, that show that it leads to more net flows of money into Social Security, given that...
Yeah, if you bring more working age population people in, you will get more taxes going into the Social Security Trust Fund.
Exactly, and that would provide another opportunity to be included in the entitlement reform mix with regard to having more younger workers paying into these programs.
We're going to have labor shortages, not now, but in the future, after boomers are fully retired. Our birth rates aren't where they need to be. They're about 1.9 right now. They need to be higher. And I do believe that immigration is one of the solutions to fixing this problem, which will, if we don't fix it, result in lower economic growth for the next generation of Americans.
Well, Mr. Cardenas, I did bring forward an amendment. It is very much in the power of this committee to grant the necessary waiver to allow that to advance to the floor. We would have nothing more than to give you $200 billion more to reduce the deficit even quicker. And I'm hopeful that we will prevail successfully upon this committee to allow the membership of the House to have that opportunity, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time, and thank the gentleman for trying to stick to the 5-minute rule. Gentleman from Orlando, Florida, the gentleman, Mr. Webster, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just had a question of the chairman. I just want to make sure there's no change in your budget for the current 2015 budget agreement with the Senate.
Correct.
Is that true?
Correct.
So there was some talk about the fact that we want to talk about today, not what's happening in 2024 or 2025. That's not true. We've already talked about it, and we understand where we're headed, and every appropriator will still be appropriating to the limit, the max that was set in that agreement.
Correct.
And no one's trying to go above that.
Correct.
I have one other question. If Well, your budget repeals the Affordable Care Act.
Yes.
The real Affordable Care Act. Not the current one, but the real one. Do you know that, or could you say that any CBO score that it was done on the original Affordable Care Act would have any semblance of relation to the Affordable Care Act that's gotten rid of the caps on out-of-pocket expenses, has basically disregarded the corporate mandate?
Yeah.
There's no score on any of that.
There is no score. We haven't had a score for 2 years.
Okay, so I really don't even know what happens with the Affordable Care Act or the unaffordable care suggestion as we have it today.
The law is changing constantly, as you know, and it's changing beyond just what was scheduled to take place because of all these regulatory changes.
And some of those things I've heard may not ever come back. I mean, there's a lot of pressure not to.
Only open question.
Yeah. So we don't even really know what the cost is or what the savings is. There may not be any savings. It's certainly going to put a great burden on the current system when you assume everybody is going to be insured. And now from the low-income pool or the dish payments to hospitals, that's all up in the air. Supposedly we were going to have this glide path and get rid of that, and now you can't do it because people aren't insured. Okay, I just want to make sure those are cleared up. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for sticking within the time frame. And the gentleman from Louisville, Texas, is recognized. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ryan, if I could ask a follow-on question to that, when do you expect the Congressional Budget Office to rescore the Affordable Care Act? When should we look for that?
Now that they have a new baseline, I would like to think this summer we could probably get them to do that score. Yeah. Yeah, it's unclear at this time. So there are a lot of technical issues. You get to see Austin and I were talking about this just now. There are a lot of technical issues because there are so many moving parts with respect to the Medicare provider issues that that is the trouble we've been having, getting a full-blown score. And to what Mr. Webster said, constantly changing rules and constantly changing regulations beyond the scope of the statute makes it really hard to predict how this is going to change. The other issue is we do not yet know the actuarial rating of the pool that exists now. So we do not know what the rates will be in the future, so we do not know the subsidies that will result from that. So because of all these uncertainties, it is just tough in my mind to kind of peg a date as to when they'll have the knowledge to give us a score because the law is constantly changing. That's one of the problems.
Do you think before we have this discussion before the budget next year that we might have that information?
That's my hope and expectation, yes.
Okay. And I just want to add my support to doing a budget. I know that you did do an agreement that was a historic agreement in December, but we do have an election coming up in November, and if people don't know what we're for, they can't know what they're voting for or against.
I agree with that.
So I think we have to have this discussion, as painful as it might be.
I agree with that.
I do want to note on page 105 of the committee report, you referenced the fair tax proposal of Mr. Woodall and the flat tax proposal of Mr. Burgess. So thank you for giving proper recognition in the committee report to the two.
A lot of ideas, a lot of good ideas out there.
Fundamental tax reform provisions that are out there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. I want to thank both of you for taking your very precious and important time to be with the Rules Committee today. As always, I hope you know how much we appreciate the work that your staff does here now. Both excused, and thank you very much, both of you. We would now call it the second panel. That would include the gentleman, Mr. Scott. That would include the gentleman, Mr. Ellison, would include the gentleman, Mr. Mulvaney. I hope y'all can pull up an extra chair over there, and we'll have the clerk get us some extra water. Well, perhaps you will, perhaps you won't, but I want to make sure that I don't want it said I didn't help take care of you when you were here. All three of you have been sitting through, or at least two or three of you have been sitting through a good bit of debate that we've had on the budget today, and without objection, you know the rules. Without objection, anything you have in writing will be entered into the record. We've got people coming and going. I want to thank all of you for being here. We're going to go in order of the gentleman, Mr. Scott, then the gentleman, Mr. Ellison, then the gentleman, Mr. Mulvaney. That's the order that will go in. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Virginia.
Excuse me, Virginia, not Pennsylvania. Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you.
I apologize. I know that, Bobby. You and I have been on TV too many times.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And very briefly, offering on behalf of Marcia Fudge, gentlelady from Ohio, the budget, and Ms. Lee and Ms. Moore from Wisconsin, the Congressional Black Caucus budget. Very briefly, it starts with $2 trillion in additional revenue, and points out where you can get it with line items totaling $4.3 trillion. You only need $2 trillion. We end the sequester with $1 trillion. We have a jobs package over 3 years, $500 billion. An eradicating poverty package, $388 billion. And when the dust settles with some other policies like the public option, immigration reform, in money from the overseas contingency account operations, we end up with $1.8 trillion in deficit reduction compared to the CBO baseline. These are real numbers as opposed to the kind of numbers that are thrown around without any idea. The underlying budget, the Budget Committee budget, has $4 trillion in unnamed tax increases because they cut taxes $4 trillion and say it's revenue neutral and don't give a dime's worth of idea where they're going to find $4 trillion. Wherever they find it, we only need $2 trillion to make our budget add up. Let me end there and I can answer questions.
Appreciate the gentleman very much. Gentleman, Mr. Ellison, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me also thank the ranking member and all of the members of the committee for your hard work. And as the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, along with Raul Hall, this evening I'm going to talk about budget that speaks to the American. It's a budget authored by the Congressional Progressive Caucus that makes them better off, which is why we have a name for it, which is the Better Off budget. During our economy's best decades, Congress invested in American workforce, and every family was better off for it. But recent years have been dominated by growing income inequality, and with the Republican majority in Congress, that focus has been on deficit reduction and slashing the budget, making it harder for Americans to find decent jobs and save for the future. The Congressional Progressive Caucus Better Off budget reverses the damage budget austerity is inflicted on hardworking Americans and restores the economy to its full potential by creating 8.8 million jobs by 2017. In fact, we think the most important metric by which any budget should be judged is job creation. The Better Off budget reverses harmful cuts that have hit working families the hardest, starting with repealing the across-the-board budget cuts known as the sequester. It creates a fairer tax code so that low and middle-income families no longer pay more than they should, while the world's largest and biggest corporations benefit from unnecessary loopholes. Our budget reverses harmful pay freezes, expands benefits for federal retirees, and restores cuts to programs by American families that rely on unemployment insurance and supplemental nutrition assistance. And the Better Off budget makes it clear that the Social Security should be strengthened and expanded outside of the budget process and is consistent with the law. When the federal budget invests resources wisely, we can meet the needs of working families and shrink the deficit. The Better Off budget not only creates 8.8 million jobs, which we believe is the most important metric of any budget, it reduces the deficit by $4.08 trillion over the next 10 years. The budget has broad appeal. It carries Republican Chairman Dave Camp's financial institution excise tax, as well as Democratic Representative Jan Schakowsky's tax on millionaires and billionaires. It includes a bipartisan bill led by Republican Representative Cynthia Loomis and Democratic Representatives Peter Welch and David Price that would create transparency in the intelligence budgets. The Better Off budget creates 8.8 million jobs, reduces the deficit by $4.08 trillion, and reduces the debt and deficit more than current law and the President's budget. It's no wonder that our budget has received accolades from groups like Demos, as well as Fix the Debt. But it also fills gaps between what American people want and what so far the House majority has been willing to offer. It allows Medicare to negotiate drug prices like the VA does, and allows Americans to choose by providing a public option. It ends expensive, deeply destabilizing subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, which made $93 billion in profits in 2013, and puts a price on carbon. It implements comprehensive immigration reform and implements financial transactions tax to curb high-speed trading and allow for job creation through repairing our aging roads, bridges, and drinking water systems. And it funds public financing of campaigns to rein in special influence on elections. The Progressive Caucus budget is proud to present a budget that makes American families better off. That's why we call it the Better Off budget, and I urge my colleagues' support. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman very much. I have a question. Does the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, intend to give testimony tonight to the Rules Committee? If you do, I would ask that you go ahead and we'll have our clerk, Mr. Mulvaney, is going to act as our great clerk and Mr. Scott going to extend the gentlewoman a chair. I would ask that she come and be a part of this panel. And Mr. Mulvaney, I'll let you decide. The gentlewoman from Texas would be recognized. And the gentlewoman, as she knows, is welcome in not only in the Rules Committee, but we're delighted to see her. The gentlewoman and any of her testimony that she has will be entered into the record. The gentlewoman is recognized.
I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. What drives me to this hearing, and I thank the gentleman for his courtesy and the gentleman as well. I'm here to advocate for the Congressional Black Caucus budget and the CPC budget. But what drives me to this meeting is a meeting held with county officials where they were espousing the challenge of losing $300 million in Medicaid dollars that Harris County, I believe the fifth largest county in the nation, is losing because of the lack of expanded Medicaid that our state has chosen not to opt in. Obviously, that's with the Affordable Care Act, but the impact that has come from the Ryan budget clearly, I believe, hurts those who need access to health care. So I would like to offer my thoughts very quickly to highlight what I think are the fractions or the fractiousness of the Ryan budget. One, the cuts to transportation investment, some $52 billion, $145 billion in cuts from Pell Grants, the vouchering of Medicare, and in contrast between the EPC and the CBC budget that I'd like to emphasize is overall the budgets by the CBC and the CPC have an underlying message and an underlying purpose, and that is, and also implementation, and that is the creation of jobs. And I believe that the key element of what we need to do in a budget, it needs to be a moral compass for our nation. And the moral compass that comes out of the Congressional Black Caucus is, of course, the ending of the sequestration with the idea of directing the Ways and Means Committee to look at a source of $2 trillion in new revenue, the idea of new direct job creation, school modernization, which we've been supporting the Black Caucus, I think, for almost 20 years, and rebuilding America's neighborhood. And as you've indicated or heard from my colleagues, I'll just emphasize 2 points out of the CPC budget, which is the creation of 8 million jobs. We are doing better, Mr. Chairman, to the members. We had almost 200,000 in job creation, but we could do much better for the chronically unemployed and others. And so the idea behind the budget for all, and the point that I think is most important, is the ability to create jobs, to spur clean energy, manufacturing, and cutting-edge technological investments. And then, of course, the rationale or the rational approach to taxation. And it is baffling to me that it appears that in the Ryan budget, that individuals in the top 1%, maybe 2%, are getting a $200,000 cut in their taxes. I think Americans are willing to make sacrifices, are willing to invest. I believe in full employment. I think it's possible. I know that we have experienced a bounty of that, a lot of that in the state of Texas because of the resources we have. And I just ask my colleagues here to make in order and support the CPC budget and the CBC budget and the underlying and the Democratic budget that I know was already represented here today. And I thank you for allowing me these a few comments.
I thank the gentleman very much for testimony. Mr. Mulvaney, you've been very patient, not only sitting through this entire hearing, but also your gentleman conduct. So you get the Blue Ribbon Award, and I want to thank the gentleman very much. The gentleman's now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. I apologize in advance to my colleagues for turning my back on them. For each of the last several years, I have come before you at this time to offer the President's budget as an amendment. Last year, my amendment was ruled out of order as I was forced to come here with a blank piece of paper as the President had not offered his budget at this point in the process last year. The President has solved that problem for us this year and has given us a budget. 2 years ago, I brought the budget before this committee. It was ruled in order and did not garner a single vote on the floor, in large part because many of my Democrat colleagues believe that I had not properly referenced the President's budget. I have fixed that this year. So not only now do we have a budget, but we have a budget that is very clearly, properly contained in my amendment. Very briefly, Mr. Chairman, this is the budget that does everything the President asked. It continues the Affordable Care Act, it adopts immigration reform, supports Common Core, creates a new infrastructure bank, creates a $1 billion climate fund, increases airport fees on passengers, makes Pell Grant funding a mandatory spending program, creates a preschool program for all, increases duck stamp fees, extends emergency unemployment compensation, increases costs for TRICARE participants, and extends the federal health program to same-sex partners. It raises taxes $1.2 trillion over the 10-year window, yet never balances. I do this every year, Mr. Chairman, for the same reason, which I think it's important that the House have the opportunity to check in and vote on what the President sends us. He spends a lot of time and a lot of our money to do this. It continues to somewhat perplex me that my Democrat colleagues don't take this up, but as long as they're not willing to do so, I'd be more than happy to do it. We'll do it again next year. We'll do it when there's a Republican president as well. I think it's important that the House does get a chance to vote on what the President has sent us, and for that reason, I would ask that you hold this amendment in order.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all four of you for taking time to be here today. I did have a question, if I could, for Mr. Mulvaney, because I had a chance to study the budget from the President over the weekend, his blue book that arrived. And that is, in the budget which you're offering, if you go and look at the aggregate lines, you will see where the President does not pay a penny towards taking care of illegal aliens who've been arrested in this country for support back to local counties and states. Do you have any idea why the President has chosen to do that?
Well, I think I think that reflects his priorities. I think his priorities would be different than ours, and I think it's important that we tell the American public, as members of Congress, elected representatives, whether or not we agree or disagree with that. We may not get the chance to do that anywhere else this year, but on my amendment. So if you agree with the President that we shouldn't spend any money on that, then you can vote for my amendment. If you disagree, you can vote against it.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's, I think, a fair analysis. Gentleman from Utah.
We'd just like to ask, for each budget that was presented here as an amendment, how do you handle payment in lieu of taxes, PILT money? So it's not there at all? The present law does not have it in the budget. So you don't have it in the budget. Mr. Ellison? Payment in lieu of taxes, how do you handle that in your proposed budget? So none of the budgets have any reference to payment in lieu of taxes in there, PILT funding. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Mulvaney, as you know, one of the amendments that Mr. Polis is going to offer is to give us the opportunity to vote on comprehensive immigration reform. And, you know, the chairman raised the issue to you, and you said that you thought we ought to all have a vote on the president's bill because he brought it up. Do you agree that we ought to have a vote on comprehensive immigration reform in this Congress? I mean, do you feel passionately about that?
Mr. McGovern,
the says that it will save us a lot of money.
It will probably surprise you. I'm a co-sponsor of various pieces of immigration reform. So I'm here today to talk about the president's budget. Mr. McGovern, if you want to offer it, you're more than welcome. I'd be happy to give it to you.
I know Mr. Polis is offering the comprehensive
happy to give it to Mr. Polis.
Yeah.
It's not the best thing for me to put my name every single year on the president's
budget. That's all right. I know.
If you want it, you're more than welcome to have it.
I'd love to see how you present it because it's an interesting political gimmick, and I appreciate it. We'll have to see whether it's the accurate reflection or not. I'm happy to take a look at it. But I will tell you, I think the president's priorities, the ones that you've enunciated, are far better than the ones that were enunciated here a little while ago by Mr. Ryan. Let me just say to Mr. Scott and to Mr. Ellison, I support both the Congressional Black Caucus budget and the progressive budget. And I also, you know, want to say one of the reasons why I support it is because there is this, based on the previous panel we had here today, we're listening to Mr. Ryan, there seems to be this view that the only way that you can ultimately bring our budget into balance is by cutting. And one of the points I raised to him is that if you invest in National Institutes for Health, for example, you find a cure to Alzheimer's disease, you find a cure to diabetes, you find a cure to cancer, whatever. I mean, you not only improve the quality of human life, you save a lot of money. You know, you invest in our infrastructure. Yeah, there's an upfront cost, but you put people to work, and you also put a lot of other people to work, not based on public dollars. I mean, you know, businesses located in areas where there's easy access to get into and get out of. You know, there's no accident that China, for example, is making unprecedented investments in infrastructure because they want to have a more friendly business climate. So, yeah, you could make the case that one of the ways you balance the budget is by cutting, but there's the other part of it through investment. And one of the things that worries me is because we haven't been investing appropriately, and give the example of NIH again, you know, I've heard from researchers who are saying they're losing people to China and to Singapore and to other countries around the world. And I think that's a great tragedy because we're not only losing, you know, this incredible brain power that will find cures to these diseases, but we're losing jobs in the process. So there has to be a balance here. There has to be a balance. And I think both budgets, as well as one by Mr. Van Hollen, understand that balance. And so I want to thank you for doing that. And my assumption is that all these budgets will be made in order with the exception of the request by Mr. Polis, who would, you know, would like to have a vote on comprehensive immigration reform. I understand that won't be probably made in order, but I look forward to the debate on the floor, and I thank you very much for coming here.
Mr. McGovern, may I just add something to the point that you just made? On the front page of my newspaper this week was a story about a physician at MD Anderson who was in the middle of research that very much pointed to a cure for certain types of cancer. He was dependent upon R&D monies, partnerships with the NIH and others. And it is truly a key point of the negative impact of the cut in research and development. The other point that I'd just like to make is that the Ryan budget, which I know has already been discussed, completely ignores the economic benefit of comprehensive immigration reform by rejecting dollars that could in actuality help bring down the deficit, billions of dollars, if comprehensive immigration reform was put in, which is to the contrary of the budgets of CPC and the CBC.
Thank you. And just to show you that I'm bipartisan, I want to tell my Florida colleagues I really thought that your former Governor Jeb Bush made a lot of sense today when he talked about immigration reform. He talked about it in a respectful way and in an appropriate way, and I hope more of you will use his language. With that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman, Chairman Cole.
Thank you. Well, I look forward to my friend chairing Democrats for Bush when that comes up.
Not quite that. Not quite that much.
Well,
on this, he makes a lot of sense.
I'm just pleased with the movement.
Good. You know. That's good.
But I want to thank each and every one of you. Quite frankly, I think it's really important that the Congress have an opportunity to debate and consider a multitude of budgets, and whether that be the progressive budget, the Congressional Black Caucus budget, the RSC budget, which I understand my friend Mr. Woodall is going to do. I particularly want to thank you, Mr. Mulvaney, because I think you're right. I think it's very important that all these budgets have an opportunity for members to state very clearly where they stand on them. So I think it's a very useful exercise, and whether we agree on the particular of any particular budget, I think all of you do quite a service to the Congress by bringing these in front of the Congress so they can have a debate, so the American people can listen, and we can move on. So no particular questions. I just wanted to thank my colleagues for what they're doing.
Gentleman yield.
I certainly yield, my friend.
Because Mr. Cole, you usually ask one of what I think is the fairer questions that I get in this committee, which is, if your amendment passes, will you vote for the underlying bill? And I'm here today to tell you the answer is no. Ordinarily, when I bring you an amendment, I bring it because I want to try to improve the bill. But in all fairness, I'm not voting for this one.
I think that's the height of bipartisanship, that you're giving our friends an opportunity to vote on that budget, which I know they're anxious to do. So, but no, I really do think it's a service. And the President worked hard on his budget. A lot of man hours in there, a lot of thought, and it deserves a chance to sort of have its day on the floor like the others. So again, I just want to thank all my colleagues. I think you're actually all, despite different points of view, genuinely, by giving us alternatives, do the Congress and the country an enormous service. So that I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Does the gentleman from Florida seek time?
Mr. Chairman, I had a lot to say early on when Mr. Ryan and Mr. Van Hollen were here, and I'll, in the interest of time, allow that I echo the sentiments of Mr. Cole as it pertains to all the members making their presentations, and I'm deeply grateful for the time and energy that they put in. I happen to know particularly that they do an awful lot of study in bringing these matters forward, and I too am grateful that all of us will have an opportunity to vote on them.
Gentleman yields back his time. Does the gentlewoman from New York, come on, you got your Kentucky hat on. I think this is competing against the gentlewoman from Kentucky.
I'm a nervous wreck.
I know you are. Does the gentlewoman from New York seek time?
You're very kind to let me have some.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
Appreciate it very much, and I want to thank all of you as well. I think it's in the finest tradition that we have an opportunity to make some choices and choose, so thank you all for doing that. And I do want to commend to everybody, if I may, an article in Politico today. It was on the page where they were showing Supreme Court throwing money to the pigs. It's on the bottom of that, and it talked about when America thought big and the things that we used to be able to do and how we would build things and how proud we were of being first and curing diseases and all that. So a little nostalgia there. Just read what we used to be. Thank you all very much.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll say to my friend from New York, I think a lot about what we used to do and what we used to accomplish. I'm a big fan of the Hoover Dam. The stories they tell about that great engineering marvel that was not done with computers. It was done with brute will. It was done with men and men giving their lives to make that happen. I tell you, I don't believe if you and I decided that we wanted a new Hoover Dam in America, that we'd be permitted to build one today. Not no pun intended, but I don't think we could get a permit to do one today. And it makes me sad, but more sad is I'm afraid that our choices are being foreclosed. I do believe in this budget tradition. I appreciate my friend from Massachusetts suggesting that every substitute would be made in order, because that is in the highest tradition of this committee, and I appreciate my colleagues making tough choices on revenues. I believe the progressive budget bumps revenues up by almost $5 trillion. That's not an easy decision to come to. And a lot of folks like to talk the talk, but they don't want to put it down on a page, and I appreciate what you all do. I believe the Congressional Black Caucus budget just over $2 trillion in new revenues. But what concerns me is that as I looked at the President's budget, and Mr. Mulvaney, I know you're not defending the President's budget, you're just offering the President's budget, but it spent almost the money that he proposes that we spend on America over the next 10 years, about 18 months of that money was for nothing but interest on the national debt. You talk about an opportunity to do big things. You talk about children who need our support. You talk about roads who need to be built because of decisions we made yesterday and the day before that and the day before that. We lose 18 months of progress out of the next 10 years going to interest on the national debt alone, and that's when we're borrowing at the lowest teaser rates in the history of our land. And so my question is, knowing that we may disagree about priorities, I know that we all agree that it is a shame when we must give money to our creditors instead of dedicate those dollars to kids in school or the projects that we focus on. Does balancing that budget, does paying down the debt, does getting out of the business of paying our creditors and getting back into the business of investing in America, do your budgets foresee that? I'm not even talking about in the 10-year window. You may have done some scoring outside of that 10-year window, but Mr. Ellison, is there a pathway to beginning to pay our creditors back and use those dollars for investments here at home instead?
Yes, sir. I'd like to just let you know that our budget, we believe the most important metric is putting Americans back to work. But we do reduce the deficit by $4.08 trillion over the next 10 years. We think that is important. I agree with you. It's far better to send our nation's revenue into productive capacity than to just pay back creditors. And so I don't think there's really any argument there. In fact, I'd say the overall argument that we're having in America is not about some people are for debt and deficit and some people are against it. It's how do we get it down? How do we get it down? Do we just cut, or do we got to raise some money too? Or do we do both? That's the big fight.
Well, I might say it's about how frightening is that debt and deficit. I mean, it frightens me enough that I believe that revenue conversation is part of it. In our budget, we increase revenues over the 10-year window, but in the progressive budget, for example, revenues go up by $5 trillion, not an insubstantial sum, but we still don't get around to paying back any of the debt, which I presume just means that since jobs is the metric, lack of jobs more frightening than the impact of rising debt and deficits, which is fair.
I believe America can grow itself out of this debt if we invest in the productive capacity of the nation. I think history shows that too.
And let me just make a comment, because there are a couple of people here who voted on the budget in 1993. Just a couple. I'm not sure if the chairman, were you here in 1993?
No, sir.
Okay, there are three people here that were here in 19... Were you here in 1996? Yeah, just three people that were here in 1993 where we took a tough vote, passed by the slimmest of margins, and that budget put us on a trajectory where in 2001, we were on track to paying off the entire debt held by the public, and by 2008. And by 2013, by last year, we would have put all the money back in the trust funds. That was a tough vote. Many people who cast those votes lost their seats. About 50 of them lost their seats as a result of those courageous votes. But that's what you got to do. You have to raise taxes and cut spending. You have to do it responsibly, and the lines have to add up. And we did it. And so the idea of balancing the budget, but we went so far in the ditch in 2001, 2 tax cuts not paid for, 2 wars fought on the credit cards, and a prescriptive drug benefit paid on the credit card, put us in the ditch we're in now. Now, we're slowly getting back to the fiscal responsibility. The Congressional Black Caucus reduces the deficit and debt as a percentage of GDP, so we're making progress. But as Keith said, we have to put people back to work, and that's the growth in employment is one of the strategies of dealing with it. But yeah, it can be done, but it can't be done by unless you have real numbers on line items. And when you just make up numbers, food stamps getting cut 100 and some $100 billion, you couldn't. You tried 40, you tried 20, and you ended up with 8, and now you're going to get $8 billion. And to say you're going to do 100 and some is just not realistic. When you put, you have $4 trillion, underlying budget has $4 trillion in tax increases assumed in the budget without a dime of explanation of where it's coming from. You can't have a budget that's making any progress if that's the way you're adding up your numbers.
Well, though to be fair, that the House Budget Committee revenue line is the revenue line that CBO projects, that in the presence of what we would all like to see in terms of funding.
You have $4 trillion. You have $4 trillion in tax cuts, quote, revenue neutral, which means you got $4 trillion in tax increases, and not a dime's explanation how you're going to get there.
The same revenue line, increases in rates of growth, again, which is what we would all like to see. Folks can't pay taxes if they're not
But
if
you
they're not making any
describe
money.
$4 trillion in tax cuts and say it's revenue neutral. Arithmetic requires you to come up with $4 trillion in tax increases, not a dime. The CBC points out $4.3 trillion in ideas, specific line items where you can get $2 trillion from. You've got $4 trillion without a dime's worth of suggestion where it's coming from.
Again, you can keep repeating that, but it's not going to be true. What I will say to you, Mr. Scott, is look deeply, and it was commented on by my friend from Texas earlier. Not only do we have the same budget language that we've had in there in years past, laying out that framework, the same framework that we passed here in this committee to go to the floor of the House, provide expedited rules for considering that framework. We can't get enough votes to pass it, but we've absolutely laid out what it is. We also go further and mention two pieces of legislation that are actually out there line by line for all the world to see. As folks were talking about measures that they incorporated from some of our colleagues, I'd encourage you to look at H.R. 25, which is line by line every single part of the tax code that we would change and incorporated through that budget report language. So of all the criticisms that can be leveled at the committee passed budget, failure to pay attention to revenues, I can't imagine would be one of the best. But again, I respect you for pointing out the $2 trillion in new revenues that you all would seek, and yet again can't get to balance within the 10-year window. But do you project balance coming in?
Well, let me say this. We can put a little asterisk on and say, and $8 trillion in unspecified deficit reduction, if that's how you're going to do a budget. You got $4 trillion in unspecified tax increases. And count that as, then you go into Medicaid and Medicare, another $1 trillion. You know you're not going to be able to do that. Change CPI is only $0.1 trillion.
Reclaiming my time is the gentleman's point that he doesn't like the way that Paul Ryan did the committee budget, and so you're using the same bad principles in your budget. All I'm asking is, do you ever assume balance? Do you ever believe if we implement the Scott proposal tomorrow, will we ever get to balance? It's not a loaded question. I don't know the answer because you've only given me 10 years of numbers which show rising deficits and rising taxes, but no balance. I'm asking the very honest question, does the budget ever come to balance? I'd be happy to yield to that.
As a percentage of GDP, we make progress on reducing the debt and the deficit with real numbers. And we point out $4 trillion of where you can get revenues from and instruct $2 trillion in revenue increases, which is in stark contrast to a
and I frankly believe that The roadmap of the CPC and the CBC leads us, and the Democratic budget leads us to the commitment of reduction of the deficit and the debt. And I thank the gentleman.
Mr. Mulvaney, I know you have a thankless job in what you do, and I think it's important too. I asked for a seat on the Oversight Committee this cycle because I thought it was going to be President Mitt Romney, and I wanted to prove that the Oversight Committee is not about partisan chicanery, but it's about the Article 1 executive branch doing sincere oversight over the Article 1 legislative branch doing sincere oversight over the Article 2 executive branch. Clearly, I've ended up in a different space, but I appreciated your commitment to saying that a lot of time and effort has gone into this budget, and you would do the same thing for a Republican president that you would for a Democratic president. I would ask you all, who again have cared enough to come up here on Budget Day. Again, I've written the RSC budget with the help of a big team, and so I know writing budgets is not easy. I do think the president's proud of the budget that he's crafted. I can't think of any reason not to codify it and vote on it unless the outcome is a foregone conclusion and folks just don't want to see that exercise play itself out. You all have offered alternatives, much more aggressive alternatives to solving some of the problems you've identified than the president has offered. Are you surprised that none of your colleagues has picked up the president's proposal and said this is yet another good idea about how to address our country's future, that it has taken Mr. Mulvaney to pick that up? Because I don't, as he said, offering it to Mr. McGovern or Mr. Hastings, I don't think he values this as a political exercise. I think it is genuinely we don't even start our budget in the Budget Committee until after the president submits his. It's the single beginning piece of action. It's a single action that has to take place before the budget cycle can begin. In fact, CBO goes back and recalculates all of their numbers based on information the president provides. So integral is the president to the process. But in my 3 years here, I have never seen someone offer the president's budget from the Democratic side of the aisle. My question is probably less specific than why doesn't somebody pick it up and offer it, and more broad to, has the budgeting process in Washington become such theater that it's not even worth doing to take the President of the United States budget and bring it to the House floor for a vote? Have we degenerated that much in what used to be, I'm told, before my arrival here, a deliberative process, going back to that 1993 budget, Mr. Scott?
Well, I think the president offered a good budget, and we have three branches of government. The executive branch has offered its suggestions, and the legislative branch is making what we believe are improvements. One thing the president's budget has are real numbers. You've got, as I don't want to belabor the fact, but you got $4 trillion in unstated revenues. You've got another about $4 trillion in cuts that are unrealistic. And so if you subjected the underlying committee budget to real scrutiny, you got about $8 trillion, and it ain't going to happen. And that's how you get to budget. The president's budget at least adds up, and you can see where he gets the numbers and where they're going to go.
So to the extent no one offers it on the House floor for a vote, I can promise that's never going to happen either.
We have a Democratic alternative, which we believe improves the president's budget, and the Congressional Black Caucus and the progressive budget, I think, improve on the president's budget.
Well, I do hope we make all of these alternatives in order. Like I say, I know how much time and effort it takes to produce a budget. I very much appreciate the work that you all have done. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
No questions, but I do want to thank our witnesses for presenting your views and staying with us. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
The Chair would like to thank all members for their not only presence today, but also the engagement with our witnesses today. And I want to thank each and every one of you and our staff for the hard work that you put in. Chair will now be in receipt of a motion from the gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H. Conres 96, establishing the budget for the United States government for fiscal year 2015, setting forth appropriate budgetary levels for fiscal years 2016 through 2024, structured rule. The rule provides 4 hours of general debate with 3 hours confined to the congressional budget, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Budget, and 1 hour on the subject of economic goals and policies, equally divided and controlled by Representative Brady of Texas and Representative Carolyn Maloney of New York or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the concurrent resolution and provides that it shall be considered as read. The rule makes in order only those amendments printed in the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, and shall not be subject to amendment. Rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in the report, except that the adoption of an amendment in the nature of a substitute shall constitute the conclusion of consideration of the concurrent resolution for amendment. The rule provides upon the conclusion of consideration of the concurrent resolution for amendment, a final period of general debate which shall not exceed 10 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Budget. The rule permits the chair of the Budget Committee to offer amendments in the House pursuant to Section 305A.5 of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 to achieve mathematical consistency. The rule provides that the concurrent resolution shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question of its adoption. Section 2 of the rule provides that on any legislative day during the period from April 11, 2014 through April 25, 2014, A, the journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved, and B, the chair may at any time declare the House adjourned to meet at a date and time to be announced by the chair in declaring the adjournment. Section 3 of the rule provides that the Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the chair for the duration of the period addressed by Section 2 of the resolution, as though under Clause 8 of Rule 1. Section 4 of the rule provides that each day during the period addressed by Section 2 of the resolution shall not constitute a calendar day for purposes of Section 7 of the War Powers Resolution. Finally, Section 5 of the rule provides that the Committee on Appropriations may at any time before 5 p.m. on Thursday, April 17, 2014, file privilege reports to accompany measures making appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2015.
You've now heard the motion from the gentlewoman from North Carolina, and I appreciate that. Is there any discussion or amendment to the motion that's been made?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the amendment by Mr. Cardenas on number 1, which would revise the budget to accommodate comprehensive immigration reform. And before I turn the mic to Mr. McGovern, I want to remind you of this, particularly those of you that have suffered at the hands of immigration discrimination in this country. This didn't develop by accident that we are here now. And for those of us that know, and even Mr. Ryan suggested, that if we were to have substantial immigration reform, that the likelihood is it will help our economy to grow. I stand in that column, and I yield to Mr. McGovern.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, as we've discussed, the Ryan budget doesn't actually balance the way the Republicans claim it does. It relies on budget tricks like dynamic scoring and keeping all of the Affordable Care Act's revenues and Medicare efficiencies while repealing all the benefits and patient protections. But one of the reasons the Ryan budget doesn't really balance is, in 10 years, is unlike the Democratic alternative that Mr. Van Hollen is proposing, the Republicans don't assume passage of comprehensive immigration reform. The Congressional Budget Office says that if we pass the bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform bill already approved in the Senate, we would save $900 billion over 20 years. That's billion with a B. Mr. Cardenas' amendment would change the budget to assume passage of immigration reform, which has the support of Republicans and Democrats, business and labor, farmers and civil rights groups, and also happens to plug a huge part of the hole in our budget because we will have so many more jobs and people working and paying taxes. The only thing that stands between us passing comprehensive immigration reform are the Republicans in the House of Representatives. And I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Here, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, both gentlemen, very much for your discussion, further discussion. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Just for clarification, I think what the gentleman from Massachusetts, when he referenced that CBO report, it did not say that spending was going to be cut by $900 billion. It said that spending was going to rise dramatically, but revenues were going to rise even faster, and there would be a delta of $900 billion towards deficit reduction that would occur. Yield back.
Further discussion. Vote now be on the Hastings Amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Those have it, noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recording.
Gentleman asks for a roll call vote.
Ms. Fox? No. Ms. Fox, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Nugent? Mr. Nugent, no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster, no. Ms. Ross-Lehtinen? Yes. Ms. Ross-Lehtinen, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Ms. Slaughter? Yes. Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to, not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion? The vote now be on the motion from the gentlewoman from Grandfather Community, North Carolina. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. And the gentlewoman asks for a roll call vote.
Ms. Fox? Aye. Ms. Fox, aye. Mr. Bishop? Aye. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Nugent? Aye. Mr. Nugent, aye. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster, aye. Ms. Ross-Lehtinen? Aye. Ms. Ross-Lehtinen, aye. Mr. Burgess? Yeah. Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Slaughter? No. Ms. Slaughter, no. Mr. McGovern? No. Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report the total.
9 yeas, 3 nays.
The motion is agreed to. The motion is agreed to. And the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, our representative to the Budget Committee, will be handling this for the majority of the Republicans. And Mr. McGovern will be handling that for the minority. I want to thank each and every member of the Rules Committee. We will remember you tonight, Mrs. Slaughter, as you go in your regalia, fly the flag. Best of luck.
This could be a two-pie evening.
Could be a two-pie evening. I want to advise the committee that I do not believe that we will have further, at this time, not expecting further meetings during the week. The committee is now done with its work for the week.